Hello and welcome to this damnful idealistic crusade. I am the motion picture analyst, and continuing in my series of commentaries on the James Bond official films from the Eon series, we are going to discuss the eighth film, 1973's Live and Let Die, the first of 7 films to star Roger Moore, and really the start of a new era for the series. However, as I said in my previous commentary on Diamonds Are Forever, I feel Live and Let Die really forms the second part of a trilogy of sorts, and I refer to that as the Mankiewicz trilogy, because the 3 successive films, Diamonds Are Forever, Live and Let Die, and The Man with the Golden Gun, had fresh input from their screenwriter and co-screenwriter, Tom Mankiewicz, who was the American brought in to sort of not necessarily just freshen up the series, and obviously they were trying to appeal to the U.S. market. That was a big fear of United Artists post On Majesty's Secret Service, but also to inject some new blood into the series for sure. And Live and Let Die is perhaps the most interesting of the 3 because it is the one film that he wrote solo without Richard Maybaum doing any drafts or work whatsoever. So Live and Let Die becomes one of the few films in the original series that had no involvement from Richard Maybaum. Others, for example, being like You Only Live Twice. So that automatically gives it a different flavor, and it was the only film that Mankiewicz wrote solo. And he did have some involvement in the series after these 3 films. He did uncredited rewrites on The Spy Who Loved Me, and apparently did some of the pre-production work on Moonraker. But these 3 films have his tone and flavor all over them. I feel Live and Let Die in particular is a film that, like Diamonds Are Forever, which I went on and on about in the commentary, but I feel it's a film that kind of never gets looked at critically, and honestly, none of the Bond films really do the way they deserve. And I feel because of the subject matter and the label of blaxploitation that quickly gets thrown on the film, it usually gets just sort of brushed off, which is quite unfair because the film really is not a blaxploitation film, but in some very smart ways tries to use what was going on at the time to adapt a very difficult novel to bring to the screen, because the source material of Fleming's novel, which was his second novel, released in 1954, of the same name, while I do really enjoy it, and I think it's one of his best books, it's the first of the truly adventurous Bond novels where it's a straight adventure throughout the book. Bond has to go from A to Z, and just insane, amazing set pieces happen. It does have the inherent racism of the 1950s throughout, and although the villain is brilliant in Fleming's Mr. Big, and his organization sort of hidden within the black community of America in the 1950s. And it's like what we see in the film, seemingly a very mundane plot to start with, but as with all Bond's stories, it's the mundane that leads to the much more grandiose scheme. In the novel, the character of Mr. Big is smuggling discovered pirate treasure off the coast of Jamaica and is actually using it to funnel into his organization, which is actually operating under SMERSH. So Bond's classic villains of the novels, the Russian spy organization of SMERSH, are actually referenced, much in the way that we see Spectre used in the early 60s films as the recurring backseat villain, as it were. And that was always done to keep the films from getting too politicized. So in the film, of course, there's none of that, but the overall scheme is eventually revealed to be heroin smuggling. So there's a little bit of that, and if you know the novel well, you'll see a lot of really clever usages of the novel. So while Tom Mankiewicz couldn't do a straight adaptation, he did find a lot of ways to get the main idea, the main thrust of the book, that whole notion of it being sort of, it's not a chase film, but it almost has elements of being a chase film. And Bond is sort of a one-man army, which really presages a lot of action films to come. So I think you could make the argument that in a lot of ways, Live and Let Die really sort of is a forerunner to what we've come to expect from the modern action film, particularly centered around a lone heroic figure. So Again, when you look at the novel, it is filled with the inherent racism of the 50s. Although I don't think Fleming really intended it to be that way. It was something inherent to the times. When you read the novel, it is, as all of Fleming's works, brilliantly creative. But it's definitely not something that's going to play very well in our current politically correct era, and there are questionable elements in there for sure. So bringing that to the screen was not the easiest thing to do, particularly in the early 1970s. And Tom Mankiewicz specifically chose to try and tackle Live and Let Die because it was, he said in interviews later on that it was, seemingly the topical thing to do. And of the novels left to adapt that had not been, fully adapted, that seemed the most logical choice. And I think he does a really brilliant job at trying to circumvent all of the inherent racism and problems of the novel, the source material, and ensure that all the black characters on screen are intelligent, believable, fully dimensionalized characters and people. They're characters that are believable as people, and there's no throwaway characters. There's no downplaying of their intelligence. There's no character cliches or anything like that. So when you look at these characters, they're all intelligent and well drawn and have real motivations. So it manages to circumvent all the issues of the novel while keeping that idea of its Bond on a mission that continually gets more and increasingly more dangerous as it goes along. So while it may seem mundane on the surface, it's that fun dichotomy of the mundane, the everyday, the normal actually having much more going on beneath the surface, which always provides audience interest, because when you can take something we see every day and turn it on its head and give it that slant, that's how you make the mundane interesting. So I feel Live and Let Die is a film that has never quite gotten its due, and unfortunately it gets written off as the blaxploitation Bond or too 70s or too dated, when in actuality it also has a lot of similarities to Dr. No in terms of structure. And of course, the book Live and Let Die came long before the novel Dr. No. There are even some connections within the novels because both take place significantly in Jamaica, and the character of Quarrel appears in both. And there are some fun nods to Dr. No within the film that Tom Mankiewicz was able to work in. So it is, as a film, a growth over the new energy that the Eon production team, particularly Guy Hamilton and Tom Mankiewicz, created on Diamonds Are Forever. And of course, they had the challenge of bringing Roger Moore in as Bond, making him believable, and finding ways to differentiate him from the iconic Sean Connery portrayal. So there were a lot of considerations and a lot of things riding on this film, because Diamonds Are Forever had been a success at the box office, and that had to keep going for the series to continue, because there were still a lot of naysayers saying that Bond was passé and Bond was really something of the 60s, and we were now in the new era of the 1970s. So you still had to worry about capturing the U.S. market, and you had to have a really good ad campaign on top of having a great film that would impress audiences, and particularly everybody coming in with crossed arms because Sean Connery was gone once again. So there was an element of having to prove oneself, I think, which is important. It's always important to look at the historical context and the creative context behind everything. And also, as I've said before in the previous commentaries, this was the point at which Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman were alternating being the lead producer on films, because their producing partnership was really, really beyond fractured at this point. And the last film they co-produced would be the next film, The Man with the Golden Gun. But this is one of the films that was produced primarily by Harry Saltzman, and he had a completely different technique and style to Cubby Broccoli. And ironically, for being the one known for having the crazy, off-the-wall, way out there ideas, the films he really took the reins on are the more grounded, more serious, gritty films. And this being one of them, like On Her Majesty's Secret Service, when you look at the sort of alternating producer style. So I think that's another interesting, important connection to make. Now, a bit of personal history. I'm going to find it really difficult to get everything into a single commentary for this film. I'm a Bond obsessive, of course, as these commentaries really indicate. I do all of them off the cuff. I have no information planned. I have no notes. I just go in and just freehanded essentially. But Live and Let Die in particular was my introduction to the James Bond films, and is my favorite film of all time. It's the film I have seen more than any other film. No pun intended. It is the film that got me into not just James Bond, but really into motion pictures, learning how they were made, learning their history, becoming obsessed, becoming devoted to their preservation, their analysis, and their production. And so to say it holds a special place in my heart is really selling it short. So it definitely sticks in my craw very much when it just gets written off and not taken seriously, because it really is a fantastic film. Without doubt, I think the most action-packed of the entire series, and really strives to achieve some of that lost energy that happened when Peter Hunt left the series. So while it hits right at that perfect 2-hour runtime, the runtime is literally 2 hours, 1 minute, and it manages to recapture some of that lost energy. It has what is referred to in the Fleming fandom as having the Fleming swoop. Fleming's prose in his novels, and the best of them, would have this dramatic swoop of the narrative would have this drive, like this swooping drive that carries you from the beginning to the end. And Live and Let Die, the film, really has that. So I think it's very interesting to see that it is the one film solely written by Tom Mankiewicz, and it manages to build upon what he brought in and added to Diamonds Are Forever, while writing for a completely different Bond in Roger Moore, who was a different characterization. He had different elements to bring, and Mankiewicz said many times in many different interviews how you had to write for each actor differently. You had to not change the character, but you certainly could tailor moments around their strengths. You wouldn't give one moments and dialogue that was clearly intended for a completely different person, but you had to keep the core of the character the same. That's the challenge of writing a Bond script. So I know that's a bit of a long preamble. I usually do one for all of these, but I wanted to at least let you know what you're getting into, that even though I'm a James Bond obsessive, it is my life's obsession. This one in particular is what got it started at a very young age, when I rented it as a child. I think it was about 4.5, maybe 5. I've never been exactly sure of how old I was, but yes, it quickly became an explosion in my brain of pure high-octane adventure with the most urbane gentleman spy of them all. And this is the film that got me into this mess. So I wanted to say that first so I could get that out of the way, because, again, this is the film I've seen more than any other film, practically combined. The only other contenders are, of course, the official Bond films themselves. So with all that being said, let's get into the commentary with the preamble out of the way. And normally I try and do a countdown. We'll still do that, but I realized to try and make it a little bit easier with everybody's different copies, let's try starting exactly at the start of the gun barrel, so that way we can try and get a better sync, because every different version of the film has different opening and closing logos and stuff. So instead of starting your copy of the film at the 0-minute mark, go ahead and scrub through unto right at the point where the gun barrel starts, because that's usually where I start talking, and that's why there's a little gap at the start of my commentary tracks. So if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and cue it to there. And please, as I say every time, if you have the option, if you're looking at a more modern version of the film, please go to the audio selections and select the film's original mono mix, which is a wonderful single-channel mix. This film has really great audio mixing, and in particular, I think it was a greater emphasis placed on the audio due to the importance of the score, the Paul McCartney title song, and George Martin himself being, one of the great wizards of the music control room, being the fifth Beatle and having his astonishing production history. So there was no way this film was going to sound bad. The remix adds a lot of effects, and like all the Bond remixes of these single channel films, it's really a shame that the film was shackled with that. Although there is a rumor on Bond films of this era that there may have been some that had theatrical exhibition runs in some form of magnetic audio, which was a superior version of audio on 35 millimeter standard releases instead of using the optical track, and usually it was magnetic stereo. So there are rumors of a magnetic stereo mix, but in any case, that those have not been proven. But the film's mono mix really has some oomph to it that even isn't there on the previous film, Diamonds Are Forever. So with all that being said, go ahead and pull up your own copy of the film. And like I said, try and cue it to right at the start of the gun barrel. It's okay if it's on a black screen, get past the logos so we can all get on the same page, roughly, as it were. And I'll do a count-in starting now. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, press play now. So we are on the opening gun barrel. And this, of course, shot new for the film. Roger's first gun barrel, and we see, of course, the iconic fedora is gone. And Roger does his arm grab, which is iconic in gun barrels. And, of course, you'll notice right off the bat, we are in spherical widescreen territory. This was the first Bond since Goldfinger to be spherical widescreen and not in Panavision 235 scope. And seemingly this was a method of trying to control the budget. But honestly, even though Bonds are noted for being scope, I've always had a great fondness for the first 3 films and the first 2 Roger Moore films, because even though they're not scope, because they're spherical, they of course are sharper because the lenses are sharper for spherical than they are for anamorphic processes, but they're a little bit more intimate. And we have the original cameraman of the series in Ted Moore lensing Live and Let Die. This would be the last film that he shot entirely for the series. He did start The Man with the Golden Gun, but fell ill and was replaced by Oswald Morris. So the first 2 Roger Moore films kind of occupy this weird status of, it's getting to the end of an era because Harry Saltzman will leave after The Man with the Golden Gun. And we see, a good number of the original team still here, but they start to fracture off even more. Peter Hunt leaving after On Her Majesty's Secret Service was a great loss creatively, and they had to find their way again, and they had to recapture audiences. So this, of course, is a pre-title sequence that doesn't feature James Bond, and really this is the first time we've had this in quite some time in the films, but it serves its purpose because it's setting up the story. And, of course, we have the killing of agents, which harkens back again to Dr. No. So there's a lot of story structure that is very much Dr. No. It's unknown whether this was intended because Connery's first Bond was Dr. No, and so it would be helpful to have Roger Moore's first Bond have a sort of similar technique in story narrative to get the audience introduced to Bond number 3. But I think it's really just more inherent stuff. I don't think it was really intended as much because, of course, both novels primarily take place in Jamaica and share some of the same characters. And, of course, the novel Live and Let Die came, years before the novel Dr. No. But it's an interesting thing to note, and it's not something you're going to get until you see the film, 10, 15, 20 times. But, of course, we have the sparkling Mankiewicz wit here. Whose funeral is it? Yours. And we have the wonderful business of the trick coffin. And it's the little things like this that not only, like I said before, twist the mundane on its head, but it's also giving us beautiful atmosphere. We get the jazz funerals of New Orleans, which at this time in 1973, again, Bond is always going somewhere, showing audiences something different, because you wouldn't really know about jazz funerals unless you were a native of Louisiana, say. And, of course, in the commentary, Guy Hamilton admits, the reason why they went to New Orleans was, he and Tom Mankiewicz were big jazz fans, and Bond hadn't been there before. And more Mankiewicz wit, the funeral procession breaks out into song and dance as soon as the body's picked up, right out in front of the inspired Filet of Soul restaurant. I mean, that's just, it never fails to just crack me up, the Filet of Soul. But after this jaunty a little bit, we cut to our first glimpse of what is labeled as San Monique, which is, of course, a mixture of Jamaica and sets at Pinewood. Now, this is really strikingly done, the whole voodoo sequence, and all of the dancing was composed I should say, choreographed by Jeffrey Holder, who was a noted choreographer in his own right. And it really gives all these sequences an authenticity, but there's a certain tension that starts to really ramp up here. And George Martin picks up on it in his scoring with the violin strings becoming discordant and building, and we get this wonderful rhythmic editing pace building up that leads to the snake biting the unfortunate Baines. And of course, the fun part is, although the snake is a fake snake, the actor portraying Baines here literally did faint. They go up and he's fainted. So now we transition wonderfully into Maurice Binder's title sequence, which uses wonderful imagery, obviously inspired by the film, and is really one of his most beautifully striking and one of the title sequences that most perfectly fits the film it's for. And of course, this is Paul McCartney and Wings' iconic immortal title song, which is not only one of the greatest songs in the series, arguably the best title song. It is a contender along with the other top songs, but it remains one of, simply put, the greatest songs of all time. Not just from its style, its energy, its lyrical content, but even accepting the Bond connection, it is just one of those songs you can never turn off, and it's just staggering. And of course, it was all submitted. It was not even commissioned. They just the producers got this tape of Paul McCartney, and it's produced by George Martin. And of course, they couldn't say no. It was just too impacting, and it was Paul McCartney of all people. So that and other factors eventually led George Martin to be asked to do the score. Now, if you look, Sid Cain returns to do the production design, again, bringing his much more realistic style over Ken Adam. And then you see it takes a team of 3 editors for this film to replace what Peter Hunt did by himself. But I do think they do a standout job. Burt Bates returns from, he was an editor on Diamonds Are Forever, but they really achieve a sense of movement in this film that makes it almost a nonstop ride. And I've always liked, in the background of this shot, it's always seemed to me like that's one of those little fiber optic things with the little tendrils that float around. So it's kind of funny what Maurice Binder could do with simple objects and silhouettes. Again, there's Ted Moore's credit. I've always liked that it was on this really beautiful shot of this woman here, which I've always thought was maybe an illusion. Originally, Tom Mankiewicz wanted Solitaire to be a black character and have the Rosie Carver character be a white character. He proposed having Diana Ross play Solitaire, for example. So I've always thought that actress or model had a sort of look of almost Diana Ross. So it always makes me think of that. And I've always loved the image of the hands opening that Binder puts here. And we get Guy Hamilton's credit over a blood red background. And as the song fades out, we go into a very laid-back, sort of atypical introduction to our new Bond. Here we see Roger Moore for the first time. We're actually going to get glimpses of his actual living quarters. So we haven't seen this since Dr. No. So it's another nod to Dr. No, whether it's inherent or something that was intended. And Bond shows off his Pulsar watch, which was brand new at the time and revolutionary technology that most people could not afford in 1973, which will soon be replaced by the iconic Rolex 5513 Submariner, which is a lifelong obsession of mine. Now, this sequence of M coming to Bond's apartment, or his flat, I should say, is a nice way of changing up the flow, not having the usual M office scene. Again, it's always how do you make this stuff fresh once again. Of course, Bernard Lee back as M. Bond's flat is very, very gentlemanly. It's very believable. It's not very large, but everything in it seems selected by Bond himself. Everything is revealing of his character. So I think that's a nice testament to Sid Cain's design for this film, which is never over the top and grandiose. There aren't the gigantic villain layers that people think of and associate with the Ken Adam designs. But everything here, as Sid Cain did on From Russia with Love, is beautifully designed, beautifully lived in, which is the key. And while some could make the argument that, Bond having to hide his lady friend, the Italian agent Miss Caruso, from his boss is maybe a little sitcom-y, but it is it's done enough, tongue in cheek, and it's not in your face, so it's charming enough. Now, here we're getting, the plot. This is what we need you to go find out, Bond. This is the problem. But it's done over Bond preparing him a fancy espresso, or I guess this is just it's a latte because it doesn't have foam, but no one had fancy coffee machines and grinders in their home, and this also probably sparked my lifelong love affair with coffee and its preparation, because I still practice that to this day. Again, it's just fun to see Bernard Lee as him out of the office. Here, Miss Moneypenny enters, the wonderful Lois Maxwell, and of course, she gets to see who's been sleeping in Bond's bed. And that, of course, is Miss Caruso, played by Madeline Smith, who was known to a lot of audiences at this time for her work in British television and a number of the classic Hammer horrors. And of course, Q would have been in this sequence as well. This is the one really notable exception where Desmond Llewellyn isn't in the series. There are two stories as to why this happened. I'd always heard that it was because he was still doing press tours for Diamonds Are Forever and America when they shot these scenes. But it's also said I believe it's in the Some Kind of Hero book, Desmond Llewellyn said that it was just, apparently Harry Saltzman thought that Q wasn't necessary and he could, skimp on a few dollars. So I'm not sure which is true, but I've heard both. But those are the explanations as to why Bond himself is giving the explanation of the gadget to M instead of Q to Bond. But it is admittedly a nice little bit of difference, and it does, again, give just a nice little bit of freshness, because we haven't seen Bond explain the gadget. And there's a nice little bit of past history because he's used it before, and Moneypenny says when she gives it to him, Q has repaired your wristwatch, and M has no idea of what he's talking about. And there's the fun little line about the overburdened British taxpayer, because Bond is just getting his watch repaired by a Q branch without M realizing that, of course, it's one of Q's gadgets. And we get a nice little bit of interplay. The coldness of M, the way Moneypenny has to play it off, and the way Bond says thank you, and they have this wonderful little interplay. And of course, they knew each other because Lois Maxwell and Roger Moore had been at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art together when they were much younger. So they had this nice chemistry that they had already obviously developed much earlier on. And it's fun. Already here we get to see Roger in the role playing around with things. Of course, the idea that everybody was terrified of it coming across as too much like Sean, Roger in particular. But you can see, he's playing it totally differently, and he is so unbelievably confident and relaxed. So it's still the same character, but it's a different tonality. And of course, the fun gag about the zipper on the dress, of course, the watch magnet did not work, and they had to tie a fishing line to the zipper, and it was a bunch of guys trying to hold the dress down out of camera range to get it to work. So it's one of those things that seems simple, but turns out to be ridiculously complicated and goofy when seen in real life. This is a brilliant montage to get Bond from London to New York, and it also gives us our first glimpse of Solitaire, the tarot cards, and beautifully edited around George Martin's music cue and timed right to the really dramatic crash when the tires of the plane hit the tarmac. Here we see Bond walking out of JFK, and in a nice bit of spycraft, he has to match the license plate of the taxi waiting for him with his actual tags on his luggage. So there's a lot of little things like that people may miss or they may not reference all the time. But, this is still a film where, it's very gritty. There is the element of spycraft. There's not necessarily the secret codes and passphrases that we see in For Much But Love, for example, but, Bond arriving in an airport and leaving is right out of the Terence Young style. And something that's always bugged me is when you talk about the Terence Young and the Guy Hamilton styles of directing Bond, I'm very much in the Terence Young camp. That is, what I feel is the strongest and, the best films of the series. However, if you look at Live and Let Die, it's really very much more of a Terence Young style film, and Guy Hamilton really does it well. That, of course, is David Hedison playing Felix Leiter. He will reappear as the same character in License to Kill in 1989. And outside of Jack Lord and Dr. No, I think he gives the most humanity to the character of Felix, who unfortunately is always a very small role in the official films. So this is our first glimpse of Whisper and the iconic killing of Bond's taxi driver, who's actually played by Joey Chitwood, who supervised all the driving effects and some of the boat stunt work for the film. And the whole build-up is wonderfully done. The music really drives the tension of the scene. And then very interestingly, you see there's no reaction, almost as if there's a nerve cut off or a poison that's fast acting. And then, of course, his foot hits the accelerator. And Bond has to quickly think, but it's his instincts that tells him that something's obviously wrong. And this is a really, interesting sequence. It would be something that, could ostensibly happen in real life. And how do you steer a speeding car from the back seat when, there's no time to react or anything? What kind of undercuts this when you see this film 1,000 times is you quickly realize that the Chevrolet production deal means that practically all the cars in the film are some form or another Chevrolets, and almost all the cars in this sequence are the same model. They're just different colors. So when you see the front shots, you see a lot of the same Chevy grille, which is admittedly a bit unintentionally humorous. But again, I also have to mention again, the music editing. Not only is George Martin's score so unbelievably strong, and I think easily the best non-John Barry score for the series, but the actual music editing, the spotting and cutting of the cues for the film are just spot on. They are cut in exactly the right places. And if you listen to the accompanying soundtrack, you can hear where the certain cues run on a little bit longer, and they're great, don't get me wrong, but the music editing in the film really amplifies their effect and their the dramatic effect. We have a little bit of a crowd, and we see, again, another element of Roger's Bond being different from what we'd seen before, but still recognizably the James Bond that we come to know and expect. And it's little things like that, but they're also done very matter-of-factly, and so it's only when you think about it how funny it is, I hate to trouble you, Felix. Run into a little spot of bother. Now, this entire sequence nobody ever mentions, but here we see our villain, Dr. Kananga, who we don't really have established as the villain quite yet because of the film's dual identity conceit of Kananga being Mr. Big. Of course, in Fleming's novel, it's just Mr. Big, who is really a figure of the underworld, and the film changes that to Kananga being the new ruler of the island of San Monique and being at the United Nations. But obviously, he's already up to enough stuff to make not only MI6, but the CIA, very suspicious of his activities since he's under their monitoring. But this whole conceit of them starting this tape of Kananga playing because they know the CIA can only listen in, and they go in and then they start to put their, more active costumes on, and we cut back to the CIA just, monitoring everything. By the way, it took me forever to notice the guy who hands Felix the clipboard is like fighting a sinus infection, so I don't know if that was just the actor on that day or something they did, but it just gives this scene a wonderful, realistic touch. And of course, capped off by the inspired Mankiewicz line, Kananga's knitting a flag in there. And then we go to another Mank touch of the occult voodoo shop. And of course, the film is filled with these. But for the most part, they're actually much more underplayed than they are in Diamonds Are Forever. Diamonds Are Forever, the humor was much more upfront, whereas Live and Let Die, even though the stakes of the villain's plot, it boils down to pretty much just heroin smuggling, the level of danger is far greater than Diamonds Are Forever. The satirical quality of Diamonds Are Forever is gone. And while the humor is there, I've always loved the tag over the skulls. These are sold for rituals. I mean, you can look at this film and find so much stuff that's not only brilliant and hysterical, but almost always the humor is in a very dark fashion because they are trying to toughen Roger up, because the fear is, people wouldn't accept him as Bond because he had played the Saint for so long. People said his acting was raising eyebrows. He was never taken seriously as an actor, which was such a detriment to his astonishing talent. because doing these parts is not an easy thing to do, and to make them look so absolutely effortless. Like this little moment here where he just looks over and does a slight double take, the way it's timed to the Sting ending George Martin's cue. I mean, that's one of those moments that just burned into my brain seeing this film. It's something as simple as that. So already Roger's carrying himself with an assurance, but you notice there's a toughness almost injected into his first two films that Guy Hamilton was really trying to maintain. And I think it works in Live and Let Die, because here Bond is appropriately cold where he needs to be, which is something that people don't give Roger credit for. And he can be really dark when he needs to be, and frequently does so throughout this film. The Man with the Golden Gun is a little bit different because it almost feels a bit forced there. Most particularly the scene with Andrea Anders in the hotel room was something that Roger himself sort of reacted against. Roger himself and most everybody would sort of agree that by the time of The Spy Who Loved Me, they sort of found the perfect balance of what Roger's Bond really was representing. But I think in Live and Let Die, the performance is so strong, and you get that wonderful added toughness that's only in the first two films that Roger did, that Guy Hamilton directed. I think it's, if I had to choose, I think it's not only my favorite Roger performance, but I think it may be his best one. Even though it is his first time around, it has that, I always like to say the first Bond performance of any actor has a nervous energy to it because it is the first time, and I think you get that extra little spark in those first films. So I think that's an interesting quality to look at. Now, this, of course, is a simple transition scene where Bond goes to Harlem, which he, of course, does in the novel as well. But you have to sell the idea that he is moving into not just a different area, because, most people did not just go into Harlem in 1973, but he is going into the villain's machine, as it were. He has eyes everywhere. And it's sold not only by George Martin's absolutely badass, darker rendering of the James Bond theme, which itself has become iconic, but the wonderful performance by Arnold Williams as the insanely grinning taxi driver, who, of course, is another of Mr. Big's machine. And we get the wonderful glimpse of, as I said before, the eyes of Mr. Big everywhere and in the most mundane places. So it gives you the idea, the sense that Bond is on enemy territory, and he's clearly, outmatched because there's all of these elements everywhere, all these people watching him, and Mr. Big knows his every move. And we get the nice setup at first of seeing who will eventually be revealed as Strutter, the CIA agent, being part of Mr. Big's crew. And the final payoff is the wonderful bit when Arnold Williams picks up his own radio. He's heading on in. Even the taxi driver is in on it. And of course, we see the Fillet of Soul return, which links us back to the pre-title sequence. So everything we saw in the pre-titles doesn't just give us atmosphere, but it gives us important material so we can recognize things once the film starts proper. And it's doing this without, chucking plot exposition at us, which is always what you want to do. And of course, Roger coming in and everyone getting silent sells the idea that he's an outsider. And, Tom Mankiewicz talked about, this scene and others in particular, that, you had to do things a little bit differently because, Sean coming into a bar like this as Bond, everything would turn out differently. There's no doubt about it. But what's interesting when you read, Fleming's novel, Bond does go to Harlem with Felix Leiter, and he goes to all the various hotspots, as it were, and experiences them, and sort of does this until they finally do get taken in by Mr. Big. So they go to several different places. So Mankiewicz has taken that idea and put it here and condensed it down so we get to it much more quickly. Of course, he's removed Felix Leiter because the Bond films are always about Bond in particular. Felix does play a nice role in the film, but it's obviously a backseat role, as it were. But this builds a nice bit of tension and a nice bit of mystery because we're in the world of Mr. Big, and we have the fun bit of the table turning around, and we have a nice bit of suspense building because we still haven't yet seen Mr. Big. Now Bond meets Solitaire for the first time, of course played by the gorgeous Jane Seymour, who in a lot of ways is like the perfect representation of the character that Fleming wrote. One of my few little qualms about the film series in general is that they never quite get the same spirited characterization that Fleming gives his heroines. And Solitaire in the novel has moments where she's a bit spunkier, but of course she is a kept woman of sorts, and Mankiewicz adds the whole notion of her occult powers being tied to her virginity, so that adds a nice bit of mysticism, which ties into the voodoo themes, which is pretty cool. So this is Julius Harris as Teehee, who is a wonderfully named character, but is only in the novel for a few pages. And here he's given the wonderfully macabre steel arm. And it's the way that Julius Harris plays these little moments, the way he laughs to himself, the wonderful gleam he gets in his eyes that sells Teehee is, he's going to be somebody really tough that Bond's going to have to deal with, because he takes a malicious pleasure in ripping the PPK apart. And of course, if you look closely at the back of the tarot cards, you see the 007 logo in them, because they were designed for the film and sold as a item you could buy in stores. I would love to get a set of those one day, but it's unknown whether it was an in-joke or nobody noticed that they had left it in the cards they used in the film. Now we see Mr. Big for the first time, of course, played by Yaphet Kotto, and in this really interesting makeup. And you look at it now, a lot of people like to complain that it looks fake and stuff, but you only see this for a few moments, and it has a sort of unreality to it that makes Mr. Big look very striking. And again, you only see it for a brief second. And of course, I can't help but mention the Mankiewicz line, names is for tombstones, maybe. And I know a second before, am I in the deck as well? You have found yourself turning over the Fool card. And we do get nice little flashes of this, Bond turning over the Lover's card and saying us, alluding to the fact that they will have the inevitable coupling together later in the film. And you see it gives Solitaire some pause, but also that's actually a reference to the novel, because when Bond is brought to Mr. Big, it's actually more like the table interrogation scene we have later, and that's where Bond's fingers actually broken in the novel. But Solitaire reads his reactions, and by his toughness realizes that he is the man to break her out of her imprisonment by Mr. Big. And so later on, she manages to escape, and that sort of starts the whole notion of the chase, because in the book there really is a chase where Mr. Big is trying to recapture Solitaire and stop Bond as they make it to a train. And that's why I think it's important to note that you still have some of those elements in the film. And of course, seeing New York in this state in the 1970s, you have that wonderful time capsule grittiness that will never happen again, because New York has been, cleaned up and changed, and so much has happened in the past few decades that it's almost looked at with a certain nostalgia now. People talk about, the golden age of gritty New York films, identifying titles particularly like The French Connection. Well, these scenes in Live and Let Die are shot on location in dangerous areas, and the production, literally went out there, and, this is a look you can't really quite recreate anymore in the current New York. Of course, Harold Strutter, CIA, wonderful name too. Again, all the little Mankiewicz touches are much more subtle. You don't catch them at all times. Although, what Strutter means exactly about You or Me, the miniature Left 74, I've never quite understood. And I like already how we have again, nodding back to Dr. No, how I've always said Dr. No is sort of Bond as detective. We have a lot of that here, because already they're trying to figure out what is the connection between Kananga and Mr. Big, because Bond has followed this trail of Kananga, and it's led up to this gangster character. So, the whole time Bond is following a trail, and he is playing the detective. Of course, the gag about the communication being in the cigarette lighter, and of course, genuine Felix Leiter illuminating. But equally as good is the transition here, where Felix is sort of taunting Bond, get away from where the real action is, admitting that Bond is going to have a vacation on a beautiful tropical island, hang up the phone. Brilliant transition into our first glimpse of Geoffrey Holder's the iconic Baron Samedi. And we get this wonderful little choreographed number, although if you stayed at a hotel where this was the evening's entertainment, I mean, this is this is a fantastic little sequence. Can you imagine staying at this hotel? And ironically, they shot this and some of the hotel stuff at the Sans Souci Hotel, which also served as the locale for Bond's hotel in Dr. No. So again, since they shot in Jamaica, when you really want to look at it, there's a lot of Dr. No stuff. And here we get a nice blink and you miss it reference to On Her Majesty's Secret Service when Bond pauses at the mention of Mrs. Bond. Not only does it mean there's obviously an operative that's in Bond's room waiting on him, but obviously referencing Tracy Bond, who was killed at the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. And you see Bond have to sort of shrug it off, but diehard fans will recognize that. And we get a nice, an actual admitted mention of it, of course, in The Spy Who Loved Me, where, again, Roger plays it beautifully when Triple X brings up the death of his wife. I've always loved this guy who does the sort of spider walk and has that almost impossible-looking contortion. And it's almost as if Baron 70 is laughing at Bond there, which he sort of is. But, of course, again, as we're later shown, he's an agent of Kananga. So, again, going back to the idea of Kananga has spies, or his eyes are everywhere. So when you really look at the construction of the film's story, you do notice that there are a lot of little things that are really brilliantly taken from the novel to keep as much of it as you can, because it's not exactly Fleming's Mr. Big that they're doing, and it's not exactly the same story, but in the adaptation process there's a lot of little things that are there. And you could maybe make the argument that all the scenes between Bond and Rosie are reminiscent of the scenes in the middle of the novel when it's Bond and Solitaire interacting, because they're on the run from Mr. Big and his operatives, basically all the way down the east coast of the United States. It's also interesting to note that a significant portion of the film does take place in the U.S. Again, this was still a point where United Artists were still trying to really make sure they captured the U.S. market to continue the increase in financial gain and success they had on Diamonds Are Forever. And the irony is, this film actually did wind up outperforming Diamonds Are Forever by a significant margin, by millions of dollars. So a lot of people don't take that into consideration, but this film was ridiculously successful. I can't remember the exact figures, but I think Live and Let Die's worldwide gross, non-inflation adjusted, was about $160 million, whereas Diamonds was, I think, 124 or something like that. Of course, Diamonds did make a little bit more money in the U.S. gross, but significantly less in the worldwide gross, which became more and more important as time went on. And United Artists had what is without question the greatest worldwide distribution system of any of the film distributors of the 60s and 70s. And in a lot of ways, it was really a crying shame when it was disbanded, when United Artists got sucked into the MGM financial crisis that still seems to go on to this day. So with Bond here, and when we get the snake and such, you could maybe make the allusion to Dr. No and the spider, of course, originally the centipede in the novel. But it's really, again, something you haven't quite seen before. The snake comes down, and we get nice suspense because, Bond might see it. He also does this interesting thing of actually shaving with this mirror contraption inside the bathtub, which I've never seen before or since, but it's really cool. But it's also great that the snake hides behind the actual piping, and of course Bond can't see it, and when he could, he moves the mirror down. That's something Guy Hamilton loved. Guy Hamilton loved finding ways to increase the tension. And now we cut away and we see actually it's Whisper delivering the champagne. So again, it's a recurring agent of Kananga, so that amplifies the danger even more. And George Martin's score is still continuing to run, which keeps the drama maintained. It hasn't dropped out. I like how Bond just comes out and he's still wiping off the shaving cream. One wonders if he ever finished that shave. And we get to the nice setup that, Whisper is named after his voice, which will come into play when Bond is able to subdue him in the climax, and Kananga can't hear Whisper's warning. And earlier, I should have mentioned that Bond searching the room for bugs is right out of From Russia with Love. So there are a lot of little things they do to try and keep the notion of spycraft, to keep the notion of Connery's Bond, a little flash of continuity, but then to avoid the well-known cliches like Bond will not wear the traditional tuxedo here. He never orders a vodka martini shaken not stirred. It's a lot of little things like that. So it's trying to ensure that this is still Bond, but also not make it obvious that they're not trying to imitate what came before. And this, of course, becomes iconic and something that you always think of when you're in the bathroom: the impromptu flamethrower. And of course, why one would be smoking at this time is beyond me. But just a brilliant conceit, that whole bit of killing the snake that way. And Bond just does it nonchalantly. And we get this wonderful bit of drama. He goes back out and the lights are suddenly off and he sees the shadow coming up. Nice bit of drama where he searches for his gun and it's missing, which I've always wondered what happened to the PPK. Did Whisper steal it or something? But it means Bond is unarmed. And so using what he has available, uses the cigar ash to burn the hand of his would-be assailant, which of course turns out to be the unlucky Rosie Carver, or the not-so-good double agent. And it's a nice bit of subterfuge because we build up this nice suspense that goes through the death of the snake. We think that's it, but no, we get a little bit more. The lights are out, the person comes up. But Bond has been prepared for this because he found the listening devices. And showing off Bond's intelligence, he's able to piece together that she's a CIA operative, that the listening devices were there, and that she's obviously linked to Felix Leiter, confirmed by it being a standard CIA-issued pistol. If you look there at the direction, when Bond says that, Roger has the gun in his hand, and then he says, "Why?" pointed at me, and turns the gun over to face on her. So he's actually holding her at gunpoint. There's a lot of little moments like that. Roger's in the role here. Bond is appropriately the cold-hearted bastard he needs to be in the right spots. You get little flashes of the blunt instrumentation Fleming always like to talk about. And that's why I think it's a disservice to call the Roger Moore films too light, because particularly in the first two films, they are not. They have a nice grittiness to them that is helped by them being spherical, I think. They're not Panavision scope, and they are much more earthbound, which, of course, the films would get away from in Spy and Moonraker and come back to in For Your Eyes Only. So that's a nice little interesting thing. But they often don't get labeled that because they're, the people like, oh, it's got the Tom Mankiewicz humor, it's Roger Moore, they're not serious until For Your Eyes Only, which is completely not true. And when you look at this film seriously, there are wonderful moments. Even this here, where ostensibly Rosie is frightened, she sees a dead poisonous snake in the bathroom, and we see Bond sort of coldly manipulating her, and saying, we're going to find out what happened here. Kananga doesn't want us to find out, so it's going to be risking danger. And there's nothing else for us to do, or is there? And then she responds, Felix said, if all else failed, cyanide pills, which is a wonderfully funny response that we have not gotten before to one of Bond's advances. Again, there's a lot of little bits of dialogue that it's sort of blink and you miss it, but the more seriously you look at it, it's diabolically brilliant. And of course, here we have what may be the best line of the film. It's just a hat, darling, belonging to a small-headed man of limited means who lost a fight with a chicken. Nobody else in the world could say that line and pull it off. And then, she's clearly freaking out. She's literally trembling. And then Bond literally flicks it past her. It's a nice little bit. And so she does seem genuinely frightened. But, of course, later on, this is revealed to have all been an act. So, in a nice way, Rosie doesn't turn out to be the bimbo-type character that, unfortunately, happened in Diamonds Are Forever, where the great Tiffany Case, she starts out really rough and sassy, and unfortunately, in the last reel or two, becomes the damsel in distress sort of bimbo. It's all deceptive, so it helps sell the notion that Rosie is a double agent, which we don't know at this time, but Bond is clued into here by getting the Queen of Cups upside down, which is ostensibly from Solitaire. This is a warning, and I think it was meant to sort of imply what's in the novel, where Solitaire realizes that Bond, it would be her savior figure, if you will, to get away from Mr. Big. Also, a fun little bit, if you look at that, apparently Bond goes through an entire day of action now simply after one sip of orange juice. You don't see him eat breakfast. So it's like, holy crap, James Bond only runs on one sip of orange juice and he can do everything. Really quick there, if you look there on that building, you see a sign, it has Dr. Kananga all over it because he runs the island now. He's everywhere. It's alluded to in the dialogue that he sort of took over the government about a year or two before. You even see the San Monique police in the background. So Bond is always being watched, and he is with a double agent of Kananga. Now, here we see Quirrell Jr. for the first time, and of course, we don't know who he is at first. We get a nice bit of suspenseful subterfuge again, building up the audience, and for a little while, we think that, he's going to attack Bond, and Rosie's going to get the drop on him. Again, Guy Hamilton loved doing that. He loved building up the audience, making the audience think that, things were going to turn out a certain way. He did this all throughout Goldfinger, did this in Diamonds, and he really elevates it with Tom Mankiewicz to a new art form here, particularly in the idea of the snake pit sequence, the classic snake pit. You get the adventure hero in, and how do they get out of it? Cute touch there. If you look on the wall, there's a bunch of centerfolds cut out and taped on the wall. Again, I guess an idea to maybe make the cabin of the boat look more lived in, and they also do something similar in the submarine on The Spy Who Loved Me in the pre-titles. If you look closely, there's one wall with some centerfolds taped on it. So anyway, here we get that nice build-up. The way that Quirrell Jr. is, it looks like he's going to throw the mooring rope over Bond, and Rosie's got the drop on him, so you know what's going on. But Bond is totally nonplussed and says, so I was saying the lousy agent, but let the compensation speak for themselves. And I love the way he introduces Quirrell Jr. by saying, meet the man who shares my hairbrush. And again, most people wouldn't know this if they were not Bond fans, but it's a great bit of continuity, and it's also a great, interesting idea that Bond would have some sort of association with Quirrell's family and be working with his son. That's just something I've always loved. And we get a nice bit of cover, too. Bond here in sort of the classic wife-beater undershirt with the deep-sea fishing rod on an old boat that he ostensibly hired, although Quirrell Jr. is apparently a CIA agent himself of sorts. So we get this nice bit of cover here. It's allowing Bond to, reconnoiter the house of Kananga and go around the whole island. And it's also setting up the house. And Quirrell, Quirrell Jr. says, no one on the island dare go up there except him, which sets up later Bond infiltrating it via hang glider. And it allows us to cut back to Kananga and Solitaire, and we see that not only are his eyes reporting where Bond is, but he has his own mystical line into the future through the talents of Solitaire. And we're seeing that she is correct every time. So this is selling the idea that although it seems mumbo-jumbo, it actually is working. So it ties into the film having that theme of the occult, that theme of voodoo, and Fleming wrote about it in his novel some, Mr. Big playing with that in people's minds, even though it really wasn't real, using that sort of fear and that sort of iconography to influence people to his will. Whereas in the film, you still have that with the scarecrow, as Bond says later, these scarecrows are meant to scare people away. You're not scared. But Mankiewicz, gives it a direct line and uses that in Solitaire's character to give her sort of a... Not exactly a fantasy characterization, but there is a bit of for lack of a better term, the ye olde adventure where the princess in distress is a virgin and has magical powers. It's got a little bit of that, but never too much. It doesn't go too far into that realm because, again, as I've said, the film is actually extraordinarily down to earth, and the scale is smaller. That's something that Richard Maybaum actually said later he really didn't like about the film when he did see it. He thought it was too small, and he thought Bond had to be, about much bigger things. The world is not being threatened here. But that's something I really do enjoy about this. And And again, it really does harken back to Dr. No. So I think it does so much so that I think it was an obvious influence maybe when Tom Mankiewicz was writing the script, but I think it really does help sell Roger that the first film he did is a bit smaller in scale, and we're getting to see him as Bond and get used to Bond's character again, and it lets us go off on the next 7 films. I think that's very helpful. Now, this scene is one I always will bring up to people. People say, oh, Roger's too light. Oh, he just raises his eyebrow. This scene, Bond is pure cold. He coldly confronts Rosie. The whole act drops. And if she does not comply with what she really knows, Bond is going to kill her. And he literally pulls the PPK out, and I'll kill you if you don't. And then she has the wonderful, you could, not after what we've just done. And in the great Mankiewicz flourish, I certainly wouldn't have killed you before. That is pure gold. That is on the level of the brilliance of the Miss Taro scene in Dr. No, of Bond coldly using Miss Taro for his own pleasures while knowing what he's going to do afterwards. And we get this nice little bit here, Bond saying, used to be a convincing act, but she sees she's actually being monitored because she obviously knows that these scarecrows have cameras in them, and that, she's literally caught between a rock and a hard place. Literally, the main villain's watching her every move. They'll kill her if she says anything, and Bond coldly putting the PPK against her head almost. And, of course, it must be mentioned that it was, groundbreaking for Bond to have an interracial relationship at this time, and something very difficult for anyone to do. And, of course, when the film was shown in South Africa, this whole sequence was cut because that was still taboo, and it was still, unfortunately, taboo here in certain portions of the United States. This was still at a point in time where things like this were problematic for some people, which is ridiculous to think now, but it is something that was challenging to make a story like this at this point in time in 1973. And again, it would have been even more so had Mankiewicz's original conception of, say, Diana Ross playing Solitaire, been accepted. That was something that, the producers and United Artists literally, said, if we did that, we couldn't release the film in, such and such territories. We'd have so many problems. It's ridiculous to say, but it's true. So I think they were able to get at least some of that by having by casting Gloria Hendry as Rosie, and also selling the idea of Kananga's machine, as it were, all of these various agents and operatives that he has. But it is interesting to note that you do have to take into account, the time at which the film was made, that those issues were still prevalent. And it's interesting here that we see Solitaire have a sort of psychic block, as it were, that she can't use her abilities when stressed or, when Kananga is angry with her. That adds, I think, a nice dimension to their sort of relationship, because it's alluded to that Kananga obviously intends it to be a romantic relationship eventually, to continue the lineage of the Solitaire line, I guess you would say, so that he could have his occult readers until the end of time, just one after the other. Because he even says, if and when I decide to use that you're going to lose it, I will decide to take it away. And your mother, before you lost her power, became useless to me. So, there's this history there that's alluded to. That's really interesting. And it also must be, again, a wonderful cutaway to Julius Harris there. He just stands in the back. He has that slight curling of the lip. He just, every little moment he plays just beautifully. And we get the first glimpses of Kananga having that sort of emotional connection to Solitaire that eventually leads into Bond not only puncturing his machine, his organization, but his pride, as Dr. No would say. Of course, Bond using a hang glider here. This is mostly day for night sequencing, so certain transfers, people will say it looks a little dicey, but this was still commonplace for films at this time. It's done quite well, but certain transfers don't do the day for night very well. And Bond using a hang glider anyway was very, interesting at the time because hang gliding had not yet become a much more widespread sport. And it's an interesting way to infiltrate Kananga's mansion at night. It makes perfect sense doing this at night, being able to slip in from the air on an island. And again, George Martin's score here, starting to quote the James Bond theme, as Bond takes off his outer garments and has this wonderful little coverall over his pants, and then the wonderful reversible jacket to create the nice tropical island suit look. Not even necessary to do, but just so amazingly cool. And it is a little silly, you could say, to see Bond in the sort of solitaire garments when the table closes. Again, Tom Mankiewicz said, that's something that Roger could pull off, but Sean really couldn't. And it's very cold here that Bond manipulates Solitaire by the cards that she manipulates herself. He plays her to get the information he needs. Again, Bond's greatest weapon is not a gadget. Bond's greatest weapon is himself, his intellect, his abilities, and his abilities as a lover. This goes back, of course, to From Russia with Love and the famous, a bed scene where, of course, it's not going exactly as he plans, but, getting the information out of Tatiana Romanova by using his great physical charm. And here Bond does this and also has to read into Solitaire's character further, which he's done so by preparing this deck of cards, probably given the idea by Solitaire, tipping him off about Rosie with the Queen of Cups card. And of course, the gag here is that every single card of the deck is a lover's card. So later on the line, small confession to make, the deck was slightly stacked in my favor. I mean, it's just, it's even funnier because it's so ridiculously cold. Bond is not quite realizing what sleeping with Solitaire will do for her predicament. It's later on when she sort of spells it out for him when they're in that sort of in the bed after the act, as it were. It starts to dawn on him a little. It's like maybe I should admit it. It's also really interesting here to note the usage of color and the set and the lighting. Again, you can't get away from the fact this film was shot by Ted Moore, who knew better than anyone how a Bond film should look because he set the tone, he established the tone, and he formalized the tone. Not just in the spherical films, but of course in the scope Bond imagery as well, because he shot the first scope Bond in Thunderball. So Live and Let Die has a wonderful usage of color, even though it is much more realistic. That's why it really helps that most of the transfers of the film have been done very well. And of course, because it's spherical, it didn't suffer like the scope films when it was, on video back in the days of 4:3 televisions. So they would essentially open up the film a little bit. You got more information on top and bottom, lost a little on the sides, and you didn't have the awful pan and scanning of a scope film like, for example, on Thunderball. Again, here we have the idea of all of this realization hitting Solitaire, and Bond realizing that there's quite a little bit more to her character than he was aware of. And so by doing this, not only has he, dug her hole with, threats, deeper with Kananga, but also struck a blow at Kananga, which he intended to do anyway. There's a lot of sort of striking at the villain, the classic way Bond will do. But here in Live and Let Die, it's a lot more human. It's a lot more emotional because it genuinely gets to Kananga. It gets under Kananga's skin. Kananga almost sees himself as a James Bond character. Yaphet Kotto himself admitted that's how he played the role. And so there's a nice sort of parallel reflection between the two, Bond and villain, as there is usually, but it's heightened here because the whole conflict is on a human level. Not only does Bond start to tear apart and destroy Kananga's organization piece by piece, but he ostensibly takes the kept woman of Kananga. Again, what happens a little bit in Thunderball with Largo and Domino, but it's not felt as viscerally as it is here. And when Kananga realizes this, the Solitaire, says, when he finds out I've lost my powers, he'll kill me. And she means it, and that he will, literally. Bond counters this by, he'll have to find you first. And then the wonderful bit of the lover's lessons, which are not only cheeky in the right ways, but also if you pay attention to the first one, Bond actually says, for example, I have a boat waiting. You can be on it. But first, I need to know what happens in Voodoo Land back there. He's still pumping her for information, He is now giving her more details about all the people that have died and, the number of times they tried to stop me to find out what he's protecting. And he says, do you want to be on that boat or not? He's actually threatening her here, which is really dark. But Roger is able to soften that a little bit. You can see Bond is frustrated. You can see his plan hasn't quite worked. So he's having to think on the fly, which leads into them striking out at dawn and causing Kananga to realize that Bond has infiltrated his facility and essentially kidnapped Solitaire as far as he knows. Which is why later on, when Solitaire is recaptured, she very much on the fly, as Bond is doing here, has to pretend and realize that her only salvation is to pretend like she was an unwilling kidnappee, that Bond basically came in the middle of the night, grabbed her, and she went kicking and screaming all the way, instead of asking if there was time for Lover's Lesson number 3. And it's this little moment here that allows this scene to sell Bond and Solitaire as having a romantic relationship instead of Bond being cold with a girl that's much more of an innocent in the story going on. So Solitaire in the film does still have some of that spunk and some of that energy of Fleming's characters. So I do appreciate that Mankiewicz was able to get that in there too, and Jane Seymour was able to sell that, being such a young actress at the time. And I've also loved the fact that, again, there's the scarecrows. These scarecrows are here to scare people away, and Bond is able. They're literally just walking out of the island. They're trying to get away from Kananga, but Bond is trying to figure out what's going on. So he's walking around, and he's able to start piecing together the way that Kananga has, camouflage things, the way he's put up stuff to scare the locals away, literally. So it's a nice usage of Bond using his brain, which we don't get all the time. Now we see the cemetery from the pre-titles in the opening. We get to see it in broad daylight, and we get to see the magnificent Geoffrey Holder sans makeup, which gives this scene such a nice note of malevolence. Also, the fact that Solitaire sort of does that little wave at him, and he sort of acknowledges it, and you're like, what is going on here? And then get a nice little gadget of the flute walkie-talkie. They're heading for the hill. So we now see, of course, Kananga is still watching every move that Bond makes. If he finds it, kill him. Simple as that. Bond has no way out, or so it seems. And Roger here looks so amazingly badass. He's thrown the suit jacket away, and he's just undone his shirt, like halfway down. Again, Judas Harris has a wonderful grin as he turns to stare at Bond on the monitor, and we get a nice shot of the claw there and the bottom of the frame. And George Martin Q builds as they walk up the hill and then cuts out as Bond looks out, and it's just an empty field. So maybe his instincts were wrong. And that's why if he finds it, kill him. It's like, I can't stop him. So maybe he'll be convinced, as everybody else has been to this point. Of course, most haven't made it this far. But Bond continues on because something doesn't seem right and makes it to the point where the nets are. And this reveals, of course, it's not a field as it was seen, but it's actually the source of Kananga's scheme to essentially hijack the world drug trade. And as soon as he crosses under the nets, the helicopter comes out because they've been lying in wait to see if he finds it. It's also interesting here, when they go down, the actual bullet hits are so close to them that actually terrified Jane Seymour, because they were literally right on top of them. And it really helps to sell this sequence and the danger of it, because they're literally exploding right next to them, and they don't move at all. Of course, had they moved, they probably would have been hit by them. The helicopter's literally hovering over the nets, but of course, they can't find them because the nets are there. So it's a nice little bit of inherent humor, because the camouflage is actually camouflaging Bond away from the agents of the villain. And you can see the energy here in Coda's performance, something simple. He's just talking on a phone, but Bond has actually managed to escape, like the first layer of Kananga's defense. And so, any cost, Bond must die. Because not only has he done this, not only has he thwarted Kananga again, he's also challenged him emotionally because he's broken into his own facility and he's taken Solitaire, which is the key of Kananga's whole, not just his organization, not just his plotting, but also the whole notion of him having romantic designs on Solitaire, that hits him right in the heart. So it really enrages Kananga. So that furthers the efforts that he will go through to reclaim Solitaire. I've always loved the fact that Jane just sits calmly on the back of the bus that Bond takes off in, and this sets up the iconic double-decker bus chase, which, it's not Bond behind the wheel of the Aston Martin DB5. It's not even Bond behind the wheel of the Mustang, but it sort of takes the place, of that Las Vegas car chase in Diamonds Are Forever. But it learns from that mistake. It doesn't go on too long, and it has a point because Bond is trying to get away from Kananga's agents, which of course are the police because he, runs the island. But by using the most appropriate vehicle that would be around, it shows Bond's ingenuity as a driver. And Roger actually did do practicing with skidding a double-decker bus around, but most of the driving was done by the driver, Maurice Patchett. But Bond just looks so amazing with the half-undone shirt. He just flings this double-decker bus around and is able to thwart these police officers in much better cars and motorcycles. And he plays chicken here, and he swerves back and forth. And it's, again, showing Bond's ingenuity. He doesn't have a bunch of gadgets here, and he's still able to hold his own in a crappy old double-decker bus that's probably been on the island of San Monique for who knows how many decades now and is really rough looking and everything. And now there's one car left, and that leads to the iconic crushing and removal of the top of the double-decker bus. And what makes this work, it's a reprise of having a stunt like the two-wheel alleyway stunt with the Mustang at Diamonds Are Forever. But what sells this, it has the dramatic build-up with the music and the editing. And it doesn't cut away for laughs like Diamonds Are Forever does. It continues to build, and you think, oh my God, Bond's had it. This again uses Guy Hamilton's love of the audience misdirection. And you can see Rogers, he ducks down a little bit and he squints his eyes, and oh man, he's going for it. And again, it continues that tension that sells this sequence and makes it one of the great set pieces of the series, even though it's so small. We get this nice little humorous bit. The music fades away. We hear the cries of the children, and then it's capped off by the headless bus, as it were, tearing around the corner to get to the boat dock. We see Solitaire poking out with her hair streaming. The music swells, and then it crashes to the end of the dock. Everybody dives off. Quarrel comes out, sweet mother of pearl. Bond has, well, change of the line. It's wonderfully done, and that's the cap you need to cap the sequence off. It's not just the one-liner to undercut the tension and keep the audience moving, give you a bit of a breather. It's also in the editing and the scoring, so the whole film does that. And that's why I think Live and Let Die, it really has an energy to it that is sorely needed because, Peter Hunt is no longer in the cutting room. Again, also helps that they had 3 editors on the film instead of just 1. And now, we're told, oh, it's all over. Voodoo Land was just poppy fields. I'll turn it over to Felix and, we can go from there. And you're like, oh, well, we can't have the film over at this point. And again, most people, including Richard Maybaum, thought, okay, the plot was too simple. But here we get a nice bit of character because, again, Bond is so cold in this film. He's now lied to Solitaire because he's going to use her as bait. Again, the shot here where you see the actual shark fins, that was a lucky find. They were out shooting, and all of a sudden these shark fins broke the surface. So it's almost like the circling sharks at the edge of San Monique. They're waiting for Bond. And, of course, he's going to New Orleans to try and provoke the enemy. So he's just lied to Solitaire and said, everything's all over. But he tells Quarrel, this is a valuable piece of merchandise we're carrying, which, any luck they'll want back. And so he decides to go to New Orleans where, Hamilton was killed. It's also fun that Quarrel says Tampa is closer, which, of course, is the stop that Bond makes in the novel with Solitaire. So those scenes take place in Tampa in the novel, whereas the film goes to New Orleans instead. And of course, Bond should know immediately the dead giveaway is the same cab driver from New York. But you can see he's already, he's not thick-headed. He's not an idiot, but he's already starting to piece it together. But it happens too late. I don't know, but it sure beats the hell out of Harlem, don't it? Again, Arnold Williams has so much fun with this, and it's interesting. The film gets labeled as being blaxploitation, but I really don't think it is. But what it does, interestingly, not only are all of the black characters strong and intelligent, it also gets a lot of the black actors and actresses and talents that came up and were given great spotlights in these blaxploitation films, and it gives them spotlights in a Bond film. So they're able to shine and really stand out in a film that a lot more people were going to see. So even smaller roles like this, here we have Tommy Lane as Adam, who is essentially the chief henchman of Mr. Big in the States. He really has a great presence, and of course will last all the way to the end of the boat chase and be the final villain Bond will have to defeat to end the boat chase. And he has these great moments. There's a hell of a view of the lake from 10,000 feet. And Solitaire coming up not only sells her as being a kidnapped victim because she knows she can't get away. She says, my only regret is I won't be able to see it. But she's also giving Bond that window to get out, that one chance, so he won't be thrown on the plane. This takes us to the plane sequence with the unfortunately going to suffer some stress, Mrs. Bleecker. This is a wonderfully comic sequence, but the question is always, why doesn't Bond just take off? Why does he go around on the tarmac? I guess the idea is that he's obviously doesn't have enough room to actually taxi long enough to get the little Cessna into the air. But the inventiveness of this sequence is they take an airport and a tiny little plane and a bunch of cars and basically use it to destroy absolutely everything. Again, it's an action sequence much in the way of what we got in the Vegas car chase in Diamonds Are Forever. So while we got the vehicular part of it in the crashing of the bus, we get the destruction of all the cars here in the plane sequence. And Tom Mankiewicz said that Guy Hamilton loved doing this because he hated American cars and thought they were too big, and he loved smashing them up, which is why you see all of these cars smashed up in both Diamonds Are Forever and Live and Let Die. And I think it's interesting to know how much that Guy Hamilton and Tom Mankiewicz really sparked off of each other. And in these three films, although there are certain detractors of all three, and they're not necessarily for everyone, the way that Hamilton and Mankiewicz spark off of each other in building these sequences here, it's going to be capped off by the plane going through by the doors and shearing the wings off, which has now become iconic and ripped off a million times. They even do it in GoldenEye when Bond crashes the Cessna over the Cuban headquarters of Trevelyan. But it's also funny that, for all of their efforts, they still can't stop Bond, who actually just barely manages to get away, although you have to wonder why they don't just run up when he jumps out of the busted plane here. We get a nice, humorous cap to the whole sequence by having the unfortunate Mr. Bleecker look out and see his plane is destroyed, and Mrs. Bell is terrified. And most people miss it, but Felix Leiter on the phone here, he's having to talk to the angry Mrs. Bleecker, Mr. Bleecker. I'm sure you're a veteran, sir. Any language like that should be put forward in writing to Washington. And then Bond says, that's a little frantic. I'll keep the other three. How's Mrs. Bell? Intensive care, but she'll pull through. So this gives us a nice bit of character. Now we actually get to see Bond and Felix actually on screen together. And there's a nice chemistry between Roger and David Hedison. And again, I think Hedison has the most... I hate to say it, he has the most character. He has the most on-screen presence of any Felix, post Jack Lord, particularly when you're looking at the original films. And it's a shame he didn't get to carry on more than just, in License to Kill. And here, since we've seen the pre-titles, we know that Strutter is not long for this world. But interestingly, later, Felix is called away to the phone by saying Strutter's on the phone. So I've always wondered, is that just a gag? Did they kill Strutter and just use his name, or did they not kill him, and was this just a setup? Because we don't see him actually, get the knife in the side. But it's cool that we see all the same people come back. We see the little knife man with the glasses grinning the same way. It's the same song being played. And of course, this is the actual Olympia Brass Band, who was, apparently the number one band for doing jazz funerals. I will admit I've been to New Orleans at least twice in my life, and I have gone around these exact street corners and tried to find the exact spots where the camera setups were, and it's instilled a great love of the city in my life, just to my psyche. And so Live and Let Die has influenced me in many, many, many ways. That's just one of them. And it's also cool that the New Orleans Fillet of Soul still has the red paint on the walls, but the setup's a little different. We get the allusion to, we'll put you in a booth, and because of Bond's previous experience, nasty turn in a booth before, get a table closer to the stage instead, which sets up the dropping of the table on the floor, which is iconic and actually straight out of the novel, which of course happens when Bond and Felix go to Harlem. They are actually both sitting down, and that's when the table drops in the middle of the striptease act they're watching. But of course, Felix will get called away, and Bond will go through the ordeal himself. Now, this is, of course, a funny gag because we get the title song, wonderfully performed by B.G. Arnault, which is also included on the soundtrack. So it's a nice sort of self-referencing, and hey, buy the soundtrack album when you leave the theater in an hour and a half. But it's also really cool because it's sort of got this more lounge feel, but the way that she sort of twirls around, then she'll do her arm down when the table starts dropping. It's ridiculously ominous. So it's like, Bond, you're alone. You need to watch out. And then, of course, he drops, and it can't react fast enough. And then they have the table standing by with even the drinks and the coasters, and they put them out. Plus, I thought it was interesting why they don't take Felix as well. They just, what happened to your friend? Listen. Whereas in the novel, they grab Felix and they keep him held hostage while Mr. Big interrogates Bond, which we get that scene brought to life here. But of course, the inference is they're just going to kill Felix and get rid of him because they're interested in Bond in the novel. Whereas in the film, they just, leave Felix upstairs and forget him entirely. Of course, here, again, it's the scene in the novel where, Bond is questioned by Mr. Big and ultimately let go, but his finger is broken, and that's why that's referenced here, but not actually done. And this is where Solitaire sees Bond's strength and decides to ally with him later on. Of course, playing fast and loose with the adaptation, Mankiewicz takes that here and uses it as the moment where Kananga realizes that Solitaire has lost her powers, and his organization, his scheme is, at risk now. But he has been repeatedly insulted and provoked by Bond, and now he has been struck an emotional blow to his pride. So that causes a reaction here where you see that it starts to break through the character of Mr. Big, who we don't know is Kananga yet. Which is why Bond says, I didn't know you were that frightened of him. So you can see that anger start to come through, and he's trying to hold it in check, and he can't quite do it. And he can't break Bond either. He can't break through Bond's coldness. He can't break him. Bond holds to When I See Kananga. And this is the moment that every kid remembers, when Mr. Big starts to pull his own face off. I mean, you can complain about the makeup looking a little gimmicky now, but I mean, this is just, and it's done in sections, and Kodo starts to then rip pieces off, and Teehee is grinning malevolently, and then he finally rips off the last piece and rips the wig piece off, and you can see Bond quite revealing. And then interestingly here in the performance, you can see the anger start to subside, but Bond starts to get an anger. You can hear this sort of contained, hostility in Bond's voice, talking about being able to piece together the whole dual nature of why Kananga does this. But Kodo has this wonderful sort of, he's now bemused. He's like, okay, oh, you figured it out. Excellent, Mr. Bond. That's precisely what I intend to do. Give away 2 tons of it, to be precise. It's just a wonderful, wonderful character moment. I mean, I think without question, Kodo's performance in this dual role, it's without question one of the greatest Bond villains of all time. And it's because of this humanity he has. He sort of views himself as the mirror image of Bond in terms of being able to live the high life and have this dual identity as island despot and underworld criminal mastermind. But he's also a human being. He has human emotions. So here he's running the gamut, and Bond recognizes this, and Bond starts to play with it. So it's this wonderful back and forth they have in this scene that's at all times visceral. And so while it's also giving away the plot and it's expositional, we get all this wonderful character business. And the whole time we have Teehee in the background and Solitaire in the background. And then when Bond says that about Solitaire, we immediately go back to the darker tone. Kananga spins Bond around, who is powerless to move. But now he's got this veneer of sophistication back as Kananga. The question still stands, asked by the gentleman concerned. So he doesn't force it out of Bond, at least not yet. He allows the tension to build, Kananga does here. And this is something that Guy Hamilton really allows. And Hamilton is not given enough credit as a director. I mean, this sequence would be really dull if most people handled it, but it maintains an energy and a vibrance that's necessary and mirrors what happens in the novel. Teehee trying to take the Rolex off, and Bond saying Butterhook was an ad-lib by Roger, and one of his wonderfully inspired ad-libs. Again, nice bit of silence, those reaction shots, and then Kananga says, on the first wrong answer, Miss Solitaire, you will break the little finger, Mr. Bond's hand. And he says it with such malevolence, and Teehee is just grinning. He can't wait to just rip his finger off. And also, nice for the staging, Bond gets turned around in the chair. And of course, the clasps earlier on, the great joke is, I'd watch my step from now on if I were you, and that's when the clasps crash on his arms. And as Kananga says later, he gives Solitaire every chance here to make sure that, she still has her powers. And you can sense this. Kananga's almost desperate in a way here because he has this emotional connection to Solitaire as well. Not only is he the villain, but he wants her for himself, and he wants her to still be the way she was and be untouched and have her powers. And so he does all this, but then it's the way he says the line, and he formulates it, and then he says, "Do I speak the truth?" And then he waits for her answer, and she gives obviously the wrong answer. But he lets Bond go, and he acts as if she gave the correct answer. It's almost a cruel way of letting her think she's achieved a sort of salvation. She's managed to fool him. Teehee looks so disappointed that he can't break the finger. He's like, oh man, I was really looking forward to this. And Bond gets a reprieve, or so we think. So it's a nice little moment. I've managed to put your fears to rest. And, of course, he's getting back the Rolex, which, of course, if Bond did not get the Rolex back, it would turn out quite differently later on in the film. Of course, at this point, we could easily kill Bond, and that's the classic argument, why do the villains come up with the over-elaborate death scenario? Why don't they just kill Bond when they have the opportunity? Well, we have this wonderful location to go to, the production discovered, one of the great set pieces in cinema, really, and... But on a character note, at this point, it would not be proper for Kananga to just kill Bond. Bond has wounded him at his deepest points, and so Bond must die in agony. There's a motive of revenge in taking Bond to the crocodile farm. Again, you can see on Yaphet Kotto's face the way he carries this. He doesn't immediately get angry. He just says, "Soon, Solitaire, soon." And the emotions raging in Kananga at this point, they start to build here, and he tries to contain it. And I love the way that Baron Samedi comes over. He comes into the room, the spectral figure of death personified, and then picks up the death card and sets it on fire. Kananga puts it out, though, because he has to know why. He has to know why she has ostensibly done this to him. He has been personally affronted by this. So this again is Bond and villain not just doing the usual tete-a-tete back and forth, and Bond constantly provoking the villain. Here he has personally wounded him, and it's causing this emotional reaction. So Kananga is enraged, but he's trying to hold it in. And I love the staging of this, where Kananga reaches out, he starts to turn Solitaire like he's searching for the why in her face. And then he turns away, and then he just backhands her to the floor. And now the rage is starting to come through. He can't hold it anymore, and he finally yells, when the time came, I would feel of myself. You knew that. There's only one proper way to deal with this, one proper time. And now we get the death card. And with Kananga saying it that way and that disconnected status, it is so more chilling than it would be if he was screaming that. So this is a multifaceted villain, and it's a multifaceted Bond-villain relationship. So it's not just a one-note thing, and it adds such a... it adds so many additional flavors to what is ostensibly a much more narrowed in scale Bond film. So that's what helps this film really be much more than the simple Bond as detective, story it is on the surface. There's a lot more going on. Again, much like Dr. No. Now, this is the iconic crocodile farm that the production discovered in Jamaica, run by the actual Ross Kananga, which is why the villain was named after him. And he wound up performing the iconic stunt walking across the crocodile backs, and had to stand on the island and wear Roger Moore's suit and everything. And he actually ran this place, and it still exists in certain fashions, and I still really want to go there so badly. But I've always loved that we're still getting plot exposition here, because Bond goes into this crocodile farm, and inside it's this drug refinery. So this is showing Bond Kananga's pipeline. So he's seeing the operation. So he's still putting pieces together. And of course, he'll destroy this place and make a major dent in Kananga's, drug line, as it were, his pipeline. But it's again a blink and you miss it thing, but there's still stuff going on. And in this completely fantastic location in the middle of it, when you go inside, there's this hidden drug refinery lab. And later on, when Kananga says they tow the drug canisters under the water, and then, ostensibly this is supposed to be in Louisiana, so this would be the recovery point where it's then secretly brought inside the crocodile farm, because who would look for, drugs in a crocodile farm? They did build this bridge, apparently, for the film, and when Kananga asked them about it later, you're not going to have actors on there, and they're like, yeah, that's why we built it. And he's like, well, these animals jump out of the water. So it's like, it became rather hairy for just even shooting this sequence and having the actors around. So, the fact that this is all done for real... when the actors were out there, they did try and clear out the alligators and crocodiles from the general area they were, but there's still some there. These are still real. You can see they're right there, and it's Julius and Roger standing on the bridge. But this is Teehee standout scene where he just sinks his teeth into the whole sequence, and it tells how old Albert was the croc who ripped off his arm, which is why he has the steel arm. And it's a nice bit of character, because you're wondering, why does he have the arm? But you don't need to see it. You don't need to know about it. But you now know that a crocodile ate his arm off. So it's great character without having to show stuff. And now we get the wonderful visual moment of Teehee retreating before we realize the bridge is being retracted. And you can see the grins on their faces, the way Adam is just slowly pulling it back. And now Teehee's continuing to taunt Bond. There are two ways to disable a crocodile. Take a pencil and jab it in the pressure socket behind his eyes. The other's twice as simple. You just put your hand in his mouth and pull his teeth out. and then they laugh, and then they walk away. I mean, they have work to do, but, there is literally no way for Bond to escape this. And here, the editing becomes absolutely, spine-tingling. George Martin comes back in with his music cue, and this becomes, I think, the supreme snake pit scenario of the entire series. Every element is fine-tuned to maximize the suspense here, because we're built to believe Bond has no way out. Then we think he's going to use the watch. It's like, oh, crap, I forgot the watch. And he spies the boat, which you have to think about. If he had a boat, that would make him really able to be, hit by a crocodile if he's just paddling in a boat. But Guy Hamilton misdirects us by Bond pulls the boat out, it's tied to the tree. So Bond has to figure out another way, and now there's even less time, and the clock is ticking even further. And they had a real struggle trying to figure out how to get Bond off the island. And they got to the point where they were almost going to shoot it, and they had to ask Ross Kananga what would he do, and he said, well, I would, walk across the back of the crocodiles. You can do that, sort of. And so that's how they figure out how they get Bond off here. And the cross-cutting here between Kananga's feet, his lower torso, and right here where the crocs and alligators getting right on the island, I mean, it's right there, and you hear the sound effects of the crocs really get foleyed up, and then when their breath comes across, when their mouths open, the sound effects sell it even further, and they're right there on top of him almost. So, I mean, the fact that this is all really going on, and this is really Ross Kananga doing this, I mean, it sells it, and the editing has brought this to a point of, can he just possibly do this? Now, the music cue starts right when Bond reaches the ground. If you look at the soundtrack, it goes a little earlier. It starts a little earlier. There's a little flourish. But again, cutting it there and spotting it there makes it that immediate crash. So for me, it's like, one of the great dramatic flourishes in cinema. But the editing, the writing, the conception, and the reality of the stunt itself, and the fact that it's built to the point where there's seemingly literally no way out, and it's actual mortal peril. I mean, there's not a better snake pit scenario in the entire Bond series. There literally is not. Every aspect of the cinematic medium is brought together to make that scene work, and it's finished here by this beautifully cut together destruction of the drug compound. Not only does Bond let a crocodile in, and amusingly everybody freaks out and runs, but then he starts blowing the place up, and the explosions are timed and cut to George Martin's music. So again, the music spotting here is off the charts. Apparently, Roger did burn himself a little bit doing that. He said he burned the hairs off his hand. And of course, jumping into the boat, Bond had spotted it before, and this sets up the iconic jet boat chase sequence through the Louisiana Bayou. Of course, we have a lot of location skipping going on because we're going now back and forth between Jamaica and Louisiana. Now, Adam comes into play and is having to coordinate all of the available boat pilots that they have on call. And also, really funnily enough, they cut before he drops an F-bomb, because we did have a curse earlier on, but this was at the time where curses were really rare, and when you did them, it was you could get away with an occasional one. It was a comedic effect because it was such a rare thing. It was like, oh, they did that, which is why it was comedic earlier. And you could get away with that in a PG film in the 70s, just one or two, whereas now it would be unheard of in a PG film. Because these films, while intended for adults, it also had to be kept in mind that there would be families and children going to these. So Live and Let Die actually is a perfect entry point for anyone, particularly children, into the Bond series, because it is a straightforward, straight-ahead adventure, and you're with Bond the whole time like you are in Dr. No. You're able to, get on his side, as it were. And it's only later on, the more times you watch it, the older you get, and the more you read Fleming's novels, to see just how much of that coldness is here in the character. It's not the Roger Moore lightness everybody likes to talk about. There is a coldness and a toughness in both Live and Let Die and The Man with the Golden Gun, which is important to note, because Roger could do that, and it is a part of his characterization that the vast majority of people always overlook or underwrite or just choose to simply ignore, which is really unfair. Of course, we are introduced to the immortal Sheriff J.W. Pepper, who a lot of people maybe like to complain about, but is a a character intended to be played as a buffoon, because he is a bit of a buffoon. Also really cool, if you look in the background there's the explosion. Obviously not the same explosion as before, but it's really cool that they actually went to the time and trouble of having the little plume of smoke in the background to make it look like this has just occurred. I also like how Adam is literally prepared there to just stand there with a handgun and shoot Bond on the boat, but then realized that, here's the siren, and buttons his coat back and is just standing there calmly and goes to pull his gun, but is a little too late and is now beating himself up. He's like, "Oh, you got to be kidding me." So there's a bit of inherent humor because of that, but there is the connotation of the racism that still existed even at this time, and so that's why Pepper is created to be a comic buffoon character, to make it, not only is this, reminding audiences of, this sort of stuff still goes on, but let's take the Mickey out of the redneck sheriff, as it were. And you see there, he literally mouths an F-bomb, but it gets blared out by the boat engine. And then the hilarity continues because the second boat smashes into the sheriff's car. Then a third boat goes over, and then the next car, Adam gets away. So Sheriff Pepper has failed in every aspect of this scene. Everyone has gotten away, and his car is destroyed. So that, of course, was the famous boat jump, which was a world record breaker at the time period. And I mean, it's beautiful seeing these boats flying over. The only problem is we don't get a dramatic build up to it. We get a little bit, and then it just happens. So it's not like the build up to the bus sequence of the top deck going off. Now, this is, of course, Clifton James playing Pepper, and he was not a sheriff. He was a New York State actor. And, I mean, he's so astonishingly good as this characterization that Tom Mankiewicz came up with that you have a hard time believing that he literally wasn't a real sheriff they found. And he tries so hard that you just, in a certain way, that you start to feel, you kind of feel a little bad for this guy because he tries so hard, but he's so inept that it is enjoyable on that. And again, you're taking the Mickey out of a character like that, because there were literal characters that existed like that. And the commentaries, the production crew admitted that it's like all these sheriffs were laughing at this at this characterization of them, but the crew were like, he sounded exactly like them. I didn't know what they were laughing at. Now we get a nice bit of danger here and building up the boat chase further with another event. Bond's engine has been shot out by Pepper's pistol, and now he's running out of gas, so he has to find a new boat and literally leaves it on somebody's front lawn, and we get the wonderful image of the following boat pilots stuck in a swimming pool, and sort of in the bemusement we get similarly when the thugs are thwarted in Moonraker when their boat chase doesn't go as they planned. And Bond still can't get away. We get this nice shot of the next boat lying in wait. But, the only issue with the film's pacing, and this is something a lot of people point out, is that, this whole sequence with the boats, it does start to really go on for quite a bit. We have the constant cutbacks to the efforts of the state police and Sheriff Pepper not going too well, continually getting thwarted. And Tom Mankiewicz admitted, for the longest time in the script, this whole sequence was just, it was like, scene 221, the greatest boat chase you ever saw. And then like a month later, it was like, isn't it about time we saw what this boat chase looked like? So he had to sit down and write it. And so he and Guy Hamilton kept coming up with ideas. And originally it was going to like climax with, there were going to be some water skiers and some other stuff, but they just... it was deemed one thing too many, and they needed to move on in the schedule and the budget. And I feel like the climax with deposing Adam and in the old shipyard, I think that's a great dramatic way to end the sequence. But I can agree, from a purely pacing standpoint, a lot of the action of the film really kind of stops for this, and it is important. Bond is having to get away from Kananga. So there is a reason why he's smashing everything up, because he is running for his life. He has important information. It's not like the Vegas chase and Diamonds Are Forever, where, if Bond got arrested, all he'd have to do is call Felix. There's not, fate of the world hanging in the balance. There isn't here, but Bond is in mortal peril here, and he's not trying to smash up all Louisiana bayous in the process, but he's got to get away from Kananga's agents, which even the police are not able to stop. So until this point, they're not able to keep up with the jet boat that he's in, the Glastron boat. But now, apparently, Adam, being the intelligent agent of Kananga that he is, knows exactly where the fastest boat in the whole damn river is. I've always loved the look of this boat with the giant engine in the back and the large poles sticking out of the back and the black and yellow. So it's always interesting, and it gives a nice visual when the villain has an impressive craft in a chase sequence, whether it's on land or on water or a car chase, plane chase, whatever. If the villain does not have a vehicle up to the standard of the hero's vehicle, it doesn't have the same punch. And of course, the joke here is that Pepper doesn't see the actual pilot of the boat, and everybody starts to look around with a weird glance. So again, you can really start to see, and especially because there's no scoring. George Martin's score is not here anywhere in the boat sequence until a little bit later on when we cut to the aerial shots. So it's right here. So it finally gives the sequence more of a drive. So I think from here on out, it works just fine. So I think that people saying that this whole sequence kind of goes on a bit too long, I can understand that. I personally don't have a problem with it, of course, but I think it's interesting to note that the score doesn't start until that point. So maybe you could make the argument, had there been some score in the first half of the chase, it would maybe play a little better. And of course, the score drops out here again because we have the next set piece of Bond in boat interrupting this wedding going on. And they actually did use the people who own this land. They said they could use it, but as long as they were cast as extras. So that is those are the real boats going over. So they had to worry about what would happen if the boats went the wrong way. And so it is a pretty dangerous thing to do, to send a jet boat out of the water and over onto land, because it's really uncontrollable. And they admitted it wasn't as good as they wanted because they couldn't put stunt people in there because they had to use the actual civilians, who owned the land. Here's the next gag of the old geezer behind the old oyster truck. And honestly, this little bit is so brief that it doesn't detract from the movement of the sequence. So it's little things like that. Nothing has derailed the film in terms of injecting the humor in it. So I think that's important. Here we have another bit of the boats going over. Now they're literally just going to jump and literally skid over the road bank itself, which will cause all the cars to crash. And I have to wonder if maybe this inspired the bit in The World Is Not Enough when Bond takes the Q-boat in the Thames chase out, and even though it has a jet engine on the back, but he's basically skidding it over London roads and then goes through the restaurant before crashing back out in front of the Millennium Dome. And then to cap this part of the sequence, we have the return of the old geezer, and he will start to blow his horn. It's another example of the whole film being a one-liner. It's not just the one-liner. So now that the police are out of the way, the comic relief is gone, now we're in the meat of this sequence where it is mortal peril. Bond is having to use his wits. He has no weapon. He has no gadgets. He does have the watch, but he doesn't use it here because it's, practically useless. And Adam is no fool. He's circling around. He knows Bond is here in the shipyard. It's essentially a dead end of sorts. And he knows Bond is somewhere, so he's got to patrol around. And he pulls a shotgun out. And so Bond has to come up with something. He can't, and again, they're on water too. So it's not like he has anywhere to run. and it's an interesting location. So here we see him pouring something. It's obviously a can of gasoline, but it's like, what exactly is he going to do with this? He's got some plan he's cooked up, and he roars out. Adam takes off in chase, and now George Martin comes back in, and the score is really dramatic as Bond turns the boat around at speed. Adam's tracking him with the shotgun, and then now we see he throws the gasoline in Adam's face. And that's the only way he could defeat him, he could come up with on the fly in the moment. And then he shoves the gear lever forward. He reaches over in the boat. And you have to think about having to time that. And then these wonderful moments, the boat out of control, spinning around, Adam incapacitated, unable to do anything. He's still trying. And then Bond crashes the boats together to steer him into the derelict boat. And we get this enormous explosion, timed to the final fanfare of George Martin's cue. And this is how the boat chase ends. And now the ending humor cap to the sequence is this: make boating a fun sport, 3 miles per hour, please. And we see Bond slowly approaching. We see all the cops lined up, so they're waiting on him. And we see Felix, so we know that, Bond won't have to be, obviously taken into custody. And we get the slight little wave, and Felix having that slight perturbed look, and he's like, oh, not again. Hello, Felix, what are you doing here? And we see on that reaction shot of Bond, he's now lost Kananga. Kananga's gotten out of the country, and he's got solitaire, as Felix has just said. And now we get the culmination of the J.W. Pepper character. This is the whole reason why he's in the film, to reduce him to this level of being scraggly and almost maniacal. He rips open the handcuffs, and he's totally out of his depth at this point. And then he can't even behold the concept that Bond is a secret agent. On whose side? And I like that, Felix has gone through and, busted the fillet of sole. He didn't wait around, but you would think that they would have acted more quickly. But of course, they would have done that and then get to this point where they figured out where Bond must have been. And then this is a beautiful transition. We get the close-up on the cards. Bond brings the death card around, and we immediately cut back to the voodoo ceremony at Saint Monique. And because we've seen the opening pre-title version of this, we know what's going to happen, and we know what fate has been planned for Solitaire by Kananga. Not only is it in the occult that Solitaire was experienced in, but she knows these rituals ostensibly, and so it is perhaps the worst sort of death that Kananga could have devised for her, because by putting her in this, he doesn't even have to appear himself, and she knows what will happen to her, what her fate is. Felix says the line about watch out for sharks on the way back, which then sets up the reason why Bond was carrying a shark gun, and why the shark gun is found by Kananga, and why it's in the climax. Of course, Bond and Quarrel here get to go off on this nice final mission together, so we get to see Quarrel Jr. in the field, which is a cool touch, and they're both dressed in black to sort of suggest, army fatigues. Quarrel leaves that behind the rock there. That's how Kananga finds it. And I love how they foley up the actual music starting, and you hear the cries and the screams. Bond says, looks like the party has started. Quarrel says, my regards to Ben Samedi, right between the eyes. So I have this nice interplay. Now, this whole outfit that Roger wears here, the whole black ensemble with the oversized shoulder holster and the long-barreled revolver, I believe it's a Smith & Wesson, I may be wrong, It's really iconic in its way. It's one of the signature outfits and looks for Bond, I think. It's been referenced a number of times later on. But also, Bond using a long-barreled revolver on location, as it were, is another nod to Fleming, because after a certain point, Fleming talked about Bond having 2 weapons. He would use the PPK, or the Beretta 25. But he would also have the heavy artillery, as it were, the long-barreled Colt, as Fleming would say, under, he would use, as in Dr. No, when they went into the mangroves and towards Dr. No's fortress, he had the long-barreled revolver with him instead of the automatic. So we see Solitaire literally screaming because, again, because she is experienced in the occult, she knows exactly what her fate is. And because we, the audience, saw the death of Baines in the pre-title sequence, we know exactly what she knows. So we start to worry, okay, Bond is there, but, he's one man against all these people here who seem very hell-bent on carrying out what they did already in the pre-titles. And it starts to build, and now we get introduced to the chieftain of the ceremony, and it's fun that he comes out of a tombstone. We see in loving memory, and we see his head pop out. And of course, he's going to choose the exact same snake, which of course is, you look closely, it is obviously a fake snake. Interestingly, a number of people were terrified of snakes. I think it was said that this actor was terrified of snakes, and Geoffrey Holder, of course, was terrified of snakes, and obviously did not want to fall into the coffin of snakes, but was able to be coaxed to do it because there was actually visiting royalty on the set that day. Now, this is, of course, showing that Quirrell Jr. is planting a bunch of what I believe are thermite charges to blow up the poppy fields. And those were actually all done in miniature, and it was the first time that the miniature wizard, Derek Meddings, did any work for the Bond films. And he so impressed the entire Eon team that he came back for The Man with the Golden Gun and many more Bond films before his last Bond film was actually Goldeneye. But anyone who knows anything about special effects knows the name of Derek Meddings is, one of the absolute geniuses of film special effects, and particularly his genius for miniatures. And now here, the music starts to build, and the snake is right in front of Solitaire's face, so we feel like we're getting a reprise of the pre-titles, but Bond is looking at his watch, and it's not exactly midnight, so he's like, it's too early. But he sees it's getting close enough. And I've always loved how the actor holding the snake, his eyes start to kind of close like he's in a trance, and they get the snake head right in front of her face. Bond pulls the gun because he's going to protect Solitaire ultimately. It gets right to the very possible last moment before they break away, because, of course, Baron Samedi has to come and witness the events going on. Of course, we, the audience, and Bond, because, we are both in the same viewpoint here with Bond, have no real idea what's going on, and so the element of mystery is still here in the sequence. We see the hat, and we see, the feathers on the front. So we know something is going to happen. We don't quite know what exactly. But, can't be anything good. And the signal of sorts with the tapping on the headstone. If you look closely, there's one or two actors, I believe, that are the same actors we saw earlier in some of the scenes of in Mr. Big's enclave, as it were. So you see some of the same faces pop up again and again, again to show that his people are everywhere. Now, this is the iconic painted visage of Baron Samedi. This whole costume and outfit, this whole design is so memorable. And now here, Bond shoots the snake charmer, and then when he shoots Baron Samedi and he sort of explodes, the head explodes, and it's this mannequin thing with like a ceramic head, but then the eyes roll backward. It's impossible really to tell how they achieved that. My guess would be that got Geoffrey Holder in position and did a matte over the top piece of the head in that close-up, but it's so beautifully done, as is this editing. Soon as Bond hits the rope the first time, that's when the explosion goes off. Again, this is all the brilliance of Derek Meddings. Those shots are completely believable. You would not know it's a model, and it's a phenomenal explosion because you get all this fine detail, and you see all the leaves falling back down. Beautifully done. And here, Bond is not free to escape with Solitaire, and the real Baron Samedi comes up from the grave itself. And everyone gets quiet, and it gets really ominous. His eyes open again, except this time it's the real Baron Samedi, and we get the iconic laugh. Some people have said, why is it that Bond just doesn't shoot Baron Samedi? It's like, okay, we could have had that before Raiders of the Lost Ark, but if you count closely, I think it's because he's obviously out of bullets, because he's fired at least 6. Wonderful dramatic bit. Geoffrey Holder does that nice big intake of breath, and then Bond sort of does it's not quite dirty fighting, but he punches him instead, and he goes right into the bed of snakes. Again, Geoffrey Holder was terrified of that, so I'm sure as soon as they cut the camera, he leapt out of there. And now we get it explained how we get going in and out of the grave, and you can hear everybody get shocked that, Bond and Solitaire apparently have mystical powers too. So here is the greatest example of Kananga in the film using the beliefs of the people of the island against them by actually coming up with this whole gag of having the platform that goes in and out of ostensibly what's graves above. It's a really brilliant conceit and absolutely hysterical when you stop and think about it, that somebody would come up with that, let alone go to those links and use, his own personal, use Baron Samedi to portray this role. Of course, later on in the film, it's alluded to that, maybe it wasn't an act exactly. Because we've seen Baron Samedi die once, it was a mannequin, and we've seen him die twice in the Coffin of Snakes, and of course he will reappear in the film's climax. But that, of course, was because they simply wanted to try and have a way to have Jeffrey Holder come back because he was so effective. They were like, wouldn't it be great if he could come back somehow? I got a nice last little bit of suspense with Bond and Solitaire going around this cavern, finding these wonderful steel doors, because of course you have to have metal doors and switches in a villain's lair in a Bond film. It just wouldn't be quite the same without that. But of course, they've actually literally walked into the villain's lair. Kananga's just waiting on them and proposes a toast with champagne. Hardly unexpected, but most welcome. So we have this final last bit of Kananga putting on these airs. He's delighted to see Bond because now he gets to finish him personally, and he gets to exact this revenge that he's wanted to do for the last, 4, 5, 6 reels of the film. So Quarrel, of course, has accomplished his mission, and now they're on the boat wondering where in the heck is James Bond. But of course, you can't end a Bond film without the final confrontation with the villain. And again, here, it's small. There's only a couple of henchmen around. Eventually they go away once Bond is tied up. But again, it's much more human. Bond has so directly, he stabbed Kananga in the heart by all these actions. So Kananga has to exact this revenge. But he's still obsessed with Bond as a character. Like, he picks up the shark gun, which will, of course, be the element of his demise. But he said, I find this shotgun, it's so fascinating. He's actually interested in what Bond has to say still, because he's like, I've got to get one over on this infuriating bastard that's ruined my life. And by doing this, it's not only funny seeing Whisper on the overinflating couch, it sets up in the audience's mind what will happen when Kananga ingests this shark gun pellet with the compressed air. And it's like in your mind, okay, what would that do to a person? And so, that it's setting this up in the audience's mind because, of course, we're just seeing the shark gun for the first time. There is no cue to set it up. And again, as soon as Bond brings up Solitaire and they walk out and Kananga's going to start telling him more about, his plan and how he does this, he drops his voice down several octaves, she was especially good about predicting death. And now he's put the airs on again. Let me show you exactly how it works. We get the great Mank Witt doing a nice classic line with must have gotten tied up somewhere. Immediately crash cut to Bond and Solitaire tied up in the most compromising position, while Kananga's literally telling the plan, but he's taunting Bond. You see, he sent all the other henchmen away. It's just him and Whisper there. Bond thinks he knows, Bond thinks he's just going to drown him. Drown, Mr. Bond. You see the grin, the literal psychotic mania in Kananga's face, and then he pulls the knife out after saying, I doubt you get the chance to drown. Martin's score becomes really dramatic here, but it's very subdued, which really goes with Yaphet Kotto literally biting his lip because he's so into this moment where he literally carves into Bond's arm. And you have to wonder, what exactly is he doing here? And again, the sound effect of the knife cutting flesh in the mix, you can really feel it, and it's sold by the look on Kananga's face. And Bond manages to keep a straight face. And you have to wonder exactly what's going on because we're not exactly aware of what Kananga proposes to do. But if you look by the way Bond and Solitaire are tied together and the elements of sharks and water and blood, this is an interesting way of doing the ending of the novel, which was Bond and Solitaire being keel-hauled over coral to be eaten by sharks. They couldn't do that for time and budget. It would be later used in the film For Your Eyes Only. But it's an interesting way of getting those core elements into a smaller scale ending they could do, and that fit the film. So in a lot of ways, like the rest of this adaptation, it's a brilliant way of making a great action film and building Roger as the new Bond, but also actually adapting core elements of the novel without actually doing them. It's some genius adaptation work. And it's also a really sadistic way of killing Bond, because Kananga will get to watch slowly as Bond and Solitaire are slowly demolished by these circling sharks. And there is, flashes, of course, in the novel as well, when Felix Leiter is thrown to the sharks by the robber in the marine warehouse, which is a striking sequence of the novel that was adapted in the film License to Kill. So already at this point in time, there were portions of the novels they weren't using and would just, put on the back burner and then pull and use them later. But again, we see Bond is able to steal the bullet with the magnetic watch, so it's finally come into play and worked. Of course, here we have a sort of breaking of the rule of showing a gadget we hadn't been shown before when the watch becomes a buzzsaw, because we hadn't been shown that before. So it's a surprise instead of suspense there. The rest of the sequence is suspenseful. What I alluded to before, here, Whisper can't warn his boss because he can't be heard because of his voice ailment. And now here in this final fight between Bond and Kananga, it's a very physical fight. Bond has the blood on his arm. He still has the rope on there. You can see in Roger's face a certain gleam. You can see in Kodo's face this wonderful gleam, the way he comes at Bond with the knife. But they're really grappling for it. Kananga's just dying to kill Bond. And then Bond gets him into the water and is able to get the shark pellet in his mouth, which is the most ignominious death for Kananga possible. And while some people complain about the effect being cheesy, it's, absolutely inventive. It's definitely a death you don't forget, and, absolutely must be a horrible way to go, even though the balloon itself they use is obviously, definitely on the cheesy side. That's why it's over very fast, and it would be very graphic if you really saw somebody implode like that. And when they go up on the balloon, they optically blow up the image, which is why it becomes very distorted and grainy, because, everybody knew it was very dicey as a genuine prop. So you had to get over fast. And undercut, of course, with, he always had an inflated opinion of himself. And never once did Roger ever lose his cool or his assurance whatsoever. And he has been able to sell himself as the new James Bond with his own interpretation, but with a steely toughness in reserve when he needs it. It is there. So this whole notion of Roger being too light or playing Bond in the way that he did the Saint is absolute rubbish. It's not true whatsoever, and you need no further evidence than particularly the first two films he did directed by Guy Hamilton, but most of all in Live and Let Die. And this scene of Bond and Solitaire on the train is, of course, hearkening back to the scenes on the train in the novel where they're going from New York to St. Petersburg, Florida, where, this whole playing cards and having this nice back and forth, this nice banter is all throughout the novel. And, of course, nice allusion to, what they can do together on the train for 16 hours, as Felix asks. And we think the film is over, and we think, all the danger is past. But, of course, this being a Guy Hamilton-directed Bond film and it being a Bond film, there's almost always one character that, we may have forgotten about. One character left to be dealt with. Diamonds Are Forever, we had Winton Kidd, and in The Man with the Golden Gun, we will have Knick-Knack. So here it is Julius Harris's Teehee, who is the last man standing, as it were, and will attack Bond and Solitaire on the train, leading to the second train fight of the series. Now, again, I have to just mention once again how brilliantly done the editing, the staging, and the suspense editing of this film is. Here, we know Teehee is coming, but we see all these slow moments. The wonderful bit where he uses the claw to cut the lights out in the room. We see Solitaire blissfully unaware. He says, lock the door. We just wouldn't want anyone to walk in on us. And then we get the nice cutaway to the door becoming unlocked. And the sound makes her think that the door is locked and that James is there. First time in my life I feel like a complete woman. Slightest touch of your hand. We get this chilling shot of her hand reach out and her painted nails and being met by the opening claw. And then the camera pulls back and we see the gleaming face of Teehee there to kill them both. Noise, Bond comes out. Teehee closes the bed, gets Solitaire out of the way, and is so excited to kill him. Bond uses the cards to distract Teehee, anything to get his hands on, because again, Bond is all about his ingenuity. And again, it's great in these tiny, tiny space fights. Of course, this makes you think of From Russia with Love, and later on, Roger will have another fight with Jaws on a train in The Spy Who Loved Me. But, this also harkens back to Guy Hamilton coming up with the elevator fight in Diamonds Are Forever by getting Sean in that tiny space. So again, that adds a nice tension to this, and you're dealing with Teehee and his steel arm. And we've been waiting for this for the whole film. And like From Russia with Love, they get the window busted open so we can get all that wonderful roaring sound of the train outside coming in and adding greater tension to the fight. And we're getting nice handheld camera work, getting in close to sell this even more, again, like From Russia with Love. But the difference here is, Bond is outmatched by, this guy with a steel arm. It's like, how do you defeat this guy? And by having the shoulder exposed, Bond is able to see the wiring mechanisms and then uses part of Solitaire's beauty kit laying there to disable the arm. And again, like he's done several times, he hoists Teehee on his own petard. And it's delicious because we've waited for this the whole time. Teehee has continually taunted Bond and almost killed him. And now the steel arm he's threatened everybody with the whole movie is the source of his downfall. And he gets almost panicked here because it's so great in the fight. He has these wonderful grunts and growls as he's got Bond with the arm against his throat and everything. But, when he's actually caught, he realizes he's caught, and Bond is not going to show any compunction at killing him and just throws him overboard. And of course, Solitaire has no idea anything has happened. Bond doesn't say anything because he knows, she obviously will be frightened out of her wits. He tosses away the arm. Just being disarming, darling. One last wonderful line. And then here, completely unexplained, is Baron Samedi to give us our exit from this wonderful cocktail of action, suspense, and wonderful flavor to again suggest that maybe we have not seen the last of Baron Samedi. James Bond will return, but with one last final flourish, he takes the hat off, and we go into the main title again over the end titles. A nice reprise, which they would do pretty much at this time period by just reprising the main title song at the end titles in a abridged presentation. And we get this nice close-up on the flaming skull from Binder's opening titles, giving a nice sort of cyclical feel to the film. And we've had a wonderful, rip-roaring, tension-filled 2-hour ride. The film is, without question, a ride, but never at the expense of character for the entire cast. The entire cast of this film really shines, and it is nonstop action throughout with honestly a lot of flavor of Dr. No, and we get a lot of Bond's character because we're with Bond the entire time of the film's runtime. So James Bond will return in The Man with the Golden Gun, and that ends Live and Let Die. So, again, with all these commentaries, I'm just, running off the cuff as the film unspools, and I try to give a greater reading of character and with bits of production details and just some of the many millions of thoughts that go through my head as I rewatch these films continually. But with certain films in the series, I still feel Bond is not taken seriously as art, which it should be. But in particular, the lesser regarded films or the films that are not, generally held as being great outside of the, everybody refers to the Connery era, but they're referring to the original films of the 1960s that got the series started. And now also On Her Majesty's Secret Service and certain others. But there are always ones that sort of get glossed over, and then there's the films of the series that are always considered the black sheep or have a bad reputation, which is usually in fact, I'll say always completely undeserved, because there's no such thing as a bad Bond film or a Bond film that wastes the audience's time. There's always something interesting or exciting or different or new going on screen. They're never just wastes of time. But Live and Let Die, I think, has now fallen into a category of being one of the films that sort of gets glossed over, and because of the time period in which it was made, because it gets grouped in with blaxploitation films, and because of the story plot itself and the villain and his organization, I think most people today have a sort of image in their heads of what they think the film is, and that sometimes sort of governs what they see. They don't actually go in with an open mind, and they don't realize how much of a hit and this was in 1973, and how well received it was, because it did get good reviews, and a lot of people were genuinely surprised at how well Roger could come in and successfully pull off being Bond after Sean Connery coming back and leaving for the second time, and Diamonds Are Forever being very successful. So as I said at the beginning, Live and Let Die actually did outperform Diamonds Are Forever significantly. So it was a gamble that paid off handsomely for everyone, and it established Roger as the new Bond and a new era for the Bond films. Then it was essentially decided that this was so successful that United Artists immediately wanted a new Bond film for the next year. So we had a release of a Bond film the very next year in 1974 to sort of meet the late year desires of the backing studio, United Artists. So The Man with the Golden Gun being the next film, there's a lot of similarity in style and tone to the immediate film before. It's also the next film, it's spherical, just like Live and Let Die. But it is a bit different because Cubby Broccoli was the main producer on that film, and Richard Maybaum came back, so it was another co-written screenplay between Tom Mankiewicz and Richard Maybaum. But in retrospect, a lot of the issues people have with Man with the Golden Gun, I think, really come from the fact that they sort of kind of went into the next film without having enough of a break or a breather, because United Artists really wanted a new Bond film because Live and Let Die was so successful and they could really use that money, So I think it's interesting to note their similarities, and these, of course, will be the last two films of the series that Guy Hamilton directed, and he really is, without question, one of the key figures of the Bond team, and really being the opposite side of the coin in directing style to the founding direction of Terrence Young. So, really their two directing voices set up almost all the different core elements we have of Bond, and depending on which side of the coin you like is sort of how you fall and how you like Bond films. But I think it's so interesting to look at Live and Let Die, and that not only is it the only film written solely by Tom Mankiewicz, but it's a Guy Hamilton-directed Bond film that follows a lot of his credos and how he liked to do Bond and what he thought about Bond. But its impact and its tone is very much the style of the Terrence Young Bond film. So it's a Guy Hamilton Bond film that is very serious, and Bond really has to use his wits, and he doesn't over-rely on gadgets all the time. And there is comedy and humor, but it's inherent to the situations and the danger going on. So I think there's so much of that Dr. No feel in the film that you can't get away from Live and Let Die having a lot of those Dr. No flavors. And I think that actually really helps to establish Roger Moore and the role, because throughout the entire 2-hour runtime, we are with him as we were with Sean Connery and Dr. No. We're able to see this Bond, we're able to get on his side, we're able to see exactly what he's thinking, and we're in the same mortal peril with Bond as he's going along on this trail, systematically exposing and destroying and demolishing Kananga's machine, which is actually what James Bond does in Fleming's original novel. So while it's an adaptation of the novel and it really deviates wildly, Tom Mankiewicz actually finds insanely genius ways of still retaining the core elements of the novel, and ironically doing a lot of the set pieces from the novel while simultaneously not doing them. So I think it is a film that is multifaceted and too often gets glossed over nowadays when people remember seeing this on its original run fondly. This film made a lot of people, Bond fans, particularly young people, which is why it's no surprise, this being my first Bond experience. It's what got me into Bond and films and everything. So I still obviously have great fondness for it because it is admittedly my favorite film, period, of all time. So I hope this commentary is informative and fun, and I hope it encourages people who have stuck through the whole 2 hour plus of me rambling to look at the film more seriously and enjoy it for the really interesting work that it is. There is more going on. Again, no pun intended using the word more. There is more going on beneath the surface of it being just a fantastically well-made action film. There's tons of interesting character development and a lot of interesting moments for Bond as a character, which Roger Moore as an actor never gets the credit he deserves for. Because he is able to do things that really no other actor has been able to do before or since, and it's very hard to think of anyone else pulling off moments that you see in this film with aplomb in the way that he could, and really only he could. So, with that being said, this has been my commentary for Live and Let Die, which is a film I will love and cherish and treasure for all eternity. Have done since the first time I saw it as a child. Will continue to do so, and do so every single time I rewatch it or listen to George Martin's incredible score. And with that being said, thank you so very much for listening to this track. It means the world for people to listen to these and get something out of it, even if it's just something to have on in the background to simply be entertained by. So with that being said, I hope to return very soon in my next commentary, which will, of course, be on the 1974 film The Man with the Golden Gun. And with that, this has been my commentary for Live and Let Die. And as always, I'm very humbly yours, the motion picture analyst.